Genesis 4 is the very first story about bloodshed in the Bible. This is the story of when Cain kills Abel. And there are some weird details that might seem unimportant at first, but these small observations changed the game for me. Consider how God rejects Cain's offering and God accepts Abel's offering, and the text never gives us a clear reason why. Or how God hears the voice of Abel's blood crying out from the ground. Or how sin is described as an animal lying in wait to pounce on Cain. Again, these small details are essential for understanding the deeper meaning of this story. So let's jump into Genesis 4 to look at these key observations. All right, Genesis chapter 4. If you've been following with us on this journey through Genesis, cool. If you haven't, that's okay. I encourage you to go watch the other videos on Genesis 1 through 3. The main point of this chapter in Genesis 4 is that, well, Cain murders Abel, and he's exiled east, just as God said the seed of the serpent would be at war with the seed of the woman in Genesis chapter 3. If there are two words to best capture this chapter and what's going on here, the two words I would use is favor and bloodshed. Favor and bloodshed. Now, while you won't see those two words explicitly used, these two ideas capture, I think, where this chapter is going throughout the biblical narrative and where it's leading us as people who are following along. Okay, so let's break down each section of this chapter before we look at some key observations. Verse 1 through 2, you're going to see Cain and Abel's birth and occupations. Verse 3 through 4, Cain and Abel bring God offerings. Verse 5 through 8, Cain is jealous, and that jealousy turns into anger, which leads him to murder his brother Abel. Verse 9 through 13 is God's clear punishment for Cain. And verse 14 and 15, Cain and God converse back and forth. And then there's verse 15 through 18, Cain leaves, builds a city, has descendants. Then you'll see verse 19 through 24, Cain's evil is amplified with his descendants who grow more evil. And then the last two verses in this chapter come back to Eve having a son that replaces Abel. So some repeating key words and ideas to look for throughout this chapter. I don't want to tell you what to think. I don't even want to tell you how to think. I just want to give you some helpful tools to explore and understand this passage on your own. So some key words and ideas to look for. The concept of the ground, working, brothers, blood, the earth, conception, the woman, wives, voices, the concept of sevenfold, and then killing and murder. There's some new ideas we haven't seen in the first three chapters of Genesis that are introduced all in this one story, and I think that's very important. When you track with the narrative of Scripture and you're watching things unfold, pay very close attention to new ideas, characters, concepts that are introduced. That might be, a flag should go off in your mind to say, I should pay attention to that. So some key ideas that are introduced here that we do not see. You will not see these in the first three chapters of Genesis. The keeper of sheep, sexual relations between man and woman, offerings of fruit, offerings of fat, human anger, sin crouching to attack, murder and bloodshed, blood crying from the ground swallowing up blood, image bearers being cursed, a fugitive and a wanderer, an image bearer of God being a fugitive and a wanderer, greater punishment than one can handle, someone being hidden from God's face and God's presence, a man seeking revenge, sevenfold revenge, a mark being placed on a person, someone sent away from God's presence, someone settling in a foreign land, a city. We have not seen a city yet. Two wives, a one man having two wives. It's very odd. And then people dwelling in tents, having livestock. And then you'll see musical instruments and bronze instruments as well. So that's all just the groundwork for entering into chapter 4. I think it's really helpful to understand that this chapter can be broken down into sections, have a summary statement, have two words that capture what's going on. Watch those two words get played upon and develop throughout that chapter and that story, and then some key words and ideas, and also new ideas that we haven't seen. Whew. Now let's open the text. Genesis 4:1. I know some of you are already gone. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. And here's what Eve ends up saying. Okay, Eve is saying this. I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. God here is reduced down to nothing more than a helper and an assistant. So, something to note about verse 1 already. Eve views God as the one who simply helps her obtain a man, rather than the one who gets full credit for giving her a son. Eve is the one getting a man here, as if to be the main player, and the producer here, with God just as the assistant and the helper. Now, some of you might disagree with that conclusion and that interpretation. I think you'll see a difference between Eve's, heart posture and attitude here versus when she has Seth at the end of the chapter. She says something different. Okay, there's going to be a change in her attitude when she ends up producing and bearing Seth. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a worker of the ground. Okay, so a few things to note, at least here in verse 2. Eve actually says nothing about her second-born son, Abel. What she does say something about is Cain. There's a big statement about Cain. I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Now, of course, you're going, well, because Cain is the first, person, human being that has been produced from the womb of Eve. This is her first offspring. It's a big deal. But to say nothing about Abel is kind of odd. I wonder if this somehow, just me thinking out loud, real time, wonder if this somehow speaks to the story of Jacob and Esau later, with Jacob being Rebekah's favorite son and Esau being the father's favorite son. So that's not the only difference, though, between Cain and Abel. I might mix up the names and say Jacob and Esau, forgive me. That's not the only difference here. Abel is a keeper of the sheep, and Cain is a worker of the ground. You have a difference in occupation. You have a difference in status in the family. Cain's the firstborn, and Abel's the secondborn. And then you have a difference in the way that Eve says something about Cain, makes it seem a big deal out of Cain, and nothing for poor old Abel. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Okay, so Cain here, he brings fruit, which wonderful. We know what happens, though. Abel, on the other hand, he brings the firstborn of his flock, and he brings the fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, and we'll see in verse 5, God did not have regard for Cain's offering. So, Cain and Abel's offering takes place right here in the course of time. So what I want you to pay attention to is the fact that the text doesn't say how long. The text doesn't say how many years or how many months or when this took place. And the passage or story doesn't actually say if or when any offerings took place prior to this one. This is likely in the flow of the story, not just the first offering that we see clearly, but the first offering possibly that had ever taken place apart from God, clothing Adam and Eve, which might be a sacrifice in their place. Also, Cain here is listed as bringing an offering of the fruit of the ground. Now, again, we're going to have video after video this week exploring Genesis 4 in detail. So if I skip over something, you could share that in the comments, but I'm likely going to touch on that when we get to literary context, patterns, themes, allusions to Jesus, all those kinds of things, callbacks to previous stories. But Cain here is listed as bringing an offering to God before Abel did. Read the text. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock. Now, is that talking about sequentially? Like in the order of events, Cain did his thing, then Abel followed. Did they go at the same time? I read this likely as Cain is bringing an offering, maybe because he's the firstborn and there's something deeper happening. But either way, I read it more as Cain brought to the Lord an offering, and then Abel follows suit, maybe just imitating and following his older brother, or maybe they agree to do it at the same time. I read it as Cain is going first, being the firstborn, which might be the likely connection in my mind. Also, Cain's offering is described in less detail than Abel's is. Just pay attention. Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground. So there's two things we know about his offering. It's fruit that comes from the ground. Abel's is different. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. Much more detail, at least when I compare it with Cain's offering. He brought some fruit, which we all know comes from the ground. Abel, though, he doesn't just bring something from his flock. He doesn't just bring specifically, I don't know. He's a keeper of sheep, so you would assume sheep. He brings the firstborn and also the fat portions of that firstborn. It's like more specific with each detail. Now, just pay attention to that. I think that's going to be important to the rest of the story. Verse 4 also, the narrative doesn't state why God had regard for Abel's offering and why God did not have regard for Cain's. And the Lord had regard, right here, for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. Now, it might be helpful just to highlight with similar colors what Cain brings. Offering, fruit of the ground, okay? Now, with Abel, we'll highlight him in blue. Abel brings what? Not going to use that color. Scratch that. Abel brings the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. The Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, the Lord had no regard. So, just so you can track with how I'm keeping these things separate. Okay, that's very important. The text doesn't say why God does either thing. In both scenarios, though, it says I don't want to get ahead of myself. Cain was very angry and his face fell. Now I can say this. In both scenarios, it is not just the offering that's being accepted or rejected, but rather it's the individual that is bringing the offering. The passage doesn't say whether God starts with the person or the offering first, as if to say, you know, Abel, I accept your offering, therefore I accept you. Or, you know, Cain, I don't accept your offering, therefore I don't accept you. It doesn't say whether or not God starts with the offering the person brings or the person bringing the offering, but they are connected. God accepts the person and the offering together, as if the offering is an extension of the person themselves, as if the offering each brother brings is deeply connected to them as people in relation to God, which is very important. This is not just about offering, and you know what, I hate fruit. This is God on the basis of the person who's bringing it as well, as a part of God's evaluation. Also, if you read verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Which is the last thing an angry person wants to hear. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, bro? Why is your face fallen? Now, a couple things to note. Verse 5 and 6. Cain is not only angry, but also it says his face fell. Not only is he angry, now you can say, well, the face fallen is a way to explain or communicate the anger he's feeling, right? They're deeply connected. Think about that. Possibly. These are two ideas that are at least related, but they seem to be distinct. Also, Cain doesn't necessarily answer God's inquiry about his anger, but he remains silent. God will go on to say, if you do well, will you not be accepted? At least as far as what we have recorded in Scripture, Cain does not respond. He remains silent about the anger, and God asking him about that anger and seemingly trying to get Cain to reveal what's going on a deeper level. Also, this situation, just to give you a sneak peek into how we're going to connect this to Genesis 3, this situation is different than Genesis 3 and the sin that took place there. So in Genesis chapter 3, well, let me just start here. Right here, God talks to Cain, right? Why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? God talks to Cain before Cain ends up sinning, not just after. Cain, where's your brother? But when God talks to Adam in Genesis 3, God didn't do that. God didn't talk to Adam before the sin. God talked to Adam after the sin. With Cain, though, God speaks with Cain in between the initial desire and jealousy and the action of murdering Abel. God speaks on both ends. God didn't do that with Adam, so something about that progression might be important to pay attention to as well. If you do well, will you not be accepted if you do not do well? So we have two options here, which I'll just square up. He cannot be accepted, or, well, I'll say that if you do well or not do well, that will determine whether or not Cain is accepted. If you don't do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Cain has the legitimate option. I want to make this very clear. I don't see this passage the way other people might. What I understand from reading this in context with the rest of Scripture, of course, is that Cain does have the option to truly, legitimately rule over the sin that is crouching at the door and waiting to rule over him. I believe Cain truly has the God-given ability to not let sin rule over him in this moment. He has the free will decision to choose either or. He's not subjected to one or the other without really being able to choose. He could have ruled sin in this moment. He could have not let anger and jealousy and murderous thoughts crouch and take over him. It wasn't impossible, or I don't believe God would have told Cain to do it, and then based on whether or not Cain does that, he'll be accepted. That seems like God would be playing a pretty nasty game with Cain. Also, doing well here. If you do well, that's not clearly defined or explained. At least it relates to the idea of ruling over sin. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desires contrary to you. You must rule over it. So we know at least doing well involves ruling over sin. But I don't know if we can reduce it and limit doing well just to ruling over sin. The two might be synonymous, possibly, where God's saying, hey, doing well here means not letting sin overtake you. But there might be a step in between. And also, this is the first time the word sin is used. We've seen the concept of sin and rebellion, rejecting God's command, transgressing, missing the mark, whatever you want to refer to this sin as. But this is the first time sin is explicitly mentioned. Also, apparently, this rejection of Cain and his offering, it is not once for all. Cain still has a chance to be accepted. If you do well, which involves ruling over sin, wouldn't you be accepted? God is saying, I can accept you. I will accept you if you do well, which involves ruling over sin. If you don't, you won't be accepted. Sin's crouching at the door. So, Cain is not stuck in this without any way out. I've just been rejected, so there's no hope for me. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother. Emphasis on the brother twice. The fact that they are brethren, not just fellow image bearers, but coming from the same mama. And he killed him. And that's usually how the story gets told. Cain killed Abel. Let's move on. I think there's a lot more happening that is laying the groundwork for many other stories we're going to see throughout the Bible, of human history, and it even speaks to the human condition. Verse 8, Cain has a conversation with Abel. It's very clear in the text. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field. So something to note about this conversation is that conversation takes place before he murders Abel, obviously. And that happens, also this happens in a field, which will be reminiscent of the Joseph story and his brothers and all that. But when you combine verse 7 and 8, sin is described as an animal lying in wait to seize its prey. Sin is crouching. Cain is in the field, and he's going to end up submitting himself to the desires of sin to be used as a kind of conduit for sin to work through and bring death into the world and kill Abel. And what we're going to see when we get to this section of our teachings in Genesis 4 is that this is going to be reminiscent of and a callback to the serpent in the previous chapter, Genesis 3. Serpent's crouching around essentially waiting for his chance or his opportunity. He's more cunning than the beasts of the field, so there's a few components there. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where's Abel, your brother?" He said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Kind of, you should be. So this is the second question God has asked Cain. The first one was in verse 7 or 8. Why has your face fallen? Almost to give Cain a chance to not let this sin overtake him and rule him and lead him to murder. Here's a second question after the fact. Where's your brother? Now there's a chance for Cain to be honest and confess and be real about where he's at. Thinking about verse 9, this is, again, the second question. We're going to link this back to Genesis 3 when we get to the whole literary conversation. But Cain here, when he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" I'm just going to use this blue to underline. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, Cain should be. We should be keepers for our brethren. We should care for and concern ourselves with those who God has placed in our lives. So for Cain, he should be, but also Cain seems to be referencing the fact that Abel is a keeper of sheep. And Cain outright lies to cover up his murder. He says, "I don't know." Yes, you do. You know exactly where he is. You know exactly what happened to him. And the narrative didn't state that God was elsewhere. Think about this. Verse 8 to 9, the transition seems pretty abrupt. Cain speaking to Abel, kills him. Then the Lord said to Cain, well, where'd God come from? God seemingly appears out of nowhere. The narrative doesn't say that God was elsewhere or came to Cain. It just transitions to God suddenly speaking with Cain. There's no statement about how much time had passed or when God came or nothing like that. Just all of a sudden God speaks to Cain. is that important to pay attention to. Verse 10, and the Lord said, what have you done? And this is the third question the Lord asks Cain. The voice of your brother's blood. We have a voice and we have blood crying out from the ground. He says, the voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Something about verse 10 to note, that Abel's blood has a voice. And it's coming from the ground as a cry to God. Apparently, we'd presume for justice, right? This story has man in the ground crying out to God, right? Think about what God told Adam in Genesis 3 as part of the consequence for Adam's sin. Cursed is the ground, you'll return to the ground and the dust. And it seems as though this story takes that further, and we see that happen in the form of murder. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength, which means what? Up to this point, the ground has yielded its strength to Cain. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. So, some final questions just about verse 11 and 12, and we'll bring this to a close for the first session in Genesis 4. This story, unlike Genesis chapter 3, this story does not have the ground cursed, but has man cursed. You, directly and personally, Cain, you are cursed. You're cursed. Compared to Genesis 3, where the ground itself is the only thing, cursed for Adam. Also, God explains the reason why Cain is cursed from the ground. Because Cain's hand shed the blood of his brother, which the ground has now soaked up. So it's now blood-soaked ground because of Cain. And it's as if the ground is against Cain, contrary to Cain, because Cain struck and was contrary to his brother Abel and shed his blood. Right here, you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand, as if to connect the two ideas. Why is Cain cursed? Why is the ground contrary? Because of the fact that the ground has now soaked up innocent shed blood from a murderer. The ground is the focus in the last couple verses, verse 9, 10, 11, and 12. Abel's blood cries from the ground. Cain is cursed from the ground. The ground won't yield its strength. The ground received Abel's blood, very reminiscent of Adam's consequences in Genesis chapter 3. Also, this is a personal consequence for Cain. Rather than think of Adam's consequence in Genesis 3 that affected all humanity, apparently, this personal consequence is for Cain. Specifically, Cain personally is cursed from the ground. Also, the ground here, withholding strength from Cain, is related to the idea that he will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. These are not just random curses or statements God makes. You know what? That's not enough. You're also going to wander around and be a fugitive. The idea of Cain being a fugitive and wandering on the earth, and we'll unpack each of these things, hopefully more in depth, in the coming sessions in Genesis 4, right? But the idea of him being a fugitive and wanderer on the earth, particularly, is related to the fact that the ground will no longer yield its strength. And I just wonder if the ground and the earth there are being connected intentionally. It's not just your relationship to the ground now, Cain. You are going to wander throughout the rest of the earth. And I think the next session, we'll explore verse 13 all the way down to 26, finish this chapter, just looking at observations. Then we'll tackle literary context, allusions to Jesus, all the different things we usually unpack with each chapter we're going through. So that's all for today's first session in Genesis 4. Something to think about. Maybe this made you rethink think differently about the story. Maybe you're reading it from a different perspective now and some thoughts, or go meditate on that. Go think through that. Go pray about those things and go take notes, whatever it is. Go study this. And I hope this just motivates you to go and dive deeper into Genesis chapter 4. Genesis 4 is the first story involving bloodshed when Cain kills Abel. But there are some odd details that I missed for years that help us understand what's truly happening here. Consider how Cain has a wife when he and his parents are the only human beings on the earth. Or how Cain is afraid of being killed by someone outside of the land of Eden. Or how God puts a mark on Cain that decreases his chances of being murdered. These small details can change everything if we pay attention. Verse 13. If you haven't watched the last video in Genesis chapter 4, go watch that. It'll be helpful. You don't have to. But it says, Cain said to the Lord, after God declares the punishment Cain has earned, my punishment is greater than I can bear. So, a couple things to note. Cain, right after God says, you're going to be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. This is what he gets. Okay. What is Cain concerned with? Is he sorrowful? Is he remorseful? Is that a word? Does he show remorse for killing Abel? No, he goes, oh, my punishment is so much. Cain doesn't seem to show any remorse or sorrow for what he's done. Rather, he's more concerned with the fact that he has consequences that are too much for him. He's just sorry he got in trouble. That's what seems to be happening. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground. What is Cain driven away from? The ground, and from the face of God. He says, I shall be hidden from the face of God and driven away from the ground. Cain is cursed from the ground, okay? And that's related to the idea that he's being driven away from the presence of God, from the ground itself, because God has told him, cursed are you, in verse 11. Cursed are you from the ground. Go read verse 11. Cursed are you from the ground. Okay, so this seems to involve physical distance, where Cain is exiled, removed from the ground he currently stands on, but also what's a part of this idea is it's conveying the idea Cain won't have the strength of the ground on his side. Right here, when you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. So this is not just talking about proximity to a region, but also talking about the fact that the land is no longer on his side to yield its strength to Cain. Also, possibly the ground right outside of Eden might be what is most in focus. Because, here's why, when he says, you've driven me today away from the ground, okay, that is a general statement about how the ground will no longer yield its strength to Cain, but also the ground here is related to the face of God. Now you say, the face of God represents the favor of God shining on Cain. Absolutely, okay. But also, it will literally say that he's driven away from the presence of God. I'm going to find it in verse 16. It's in verse 16. Okay, so pay attention to this. The idea, I wrote it down like this. Possibly the ground right outside of Eden is what's most in focus because it's related to Cain being driven away from the presence of God, which means God's presence was in a specific sacred geographical location that Cain now has to leave. But it also means that God's favor is not shining upon Cain. When it says that Cain will be hidden from God's face, we'll see that idea throughout the Bible, where God's face will not shine upon them. He'll hide his face from his people, which is, the favor of God. Also, for Cain, he says, I shall be a fugitive, and I shall be a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. That's part of what it means for him to be a wanderer and a fugitive. It's not just a physical idea based on the fact that he's not home and he's in a different place, but there's also a spiritual dimension of being separated from the presence and favor of God. So right here when it says, I'll be a fugitive and a wanderer, it's not just you're a nomad. No, you're a nomad. You're just going to wander from your home. You won't live here anymore. Eventually Cain will settle down and build a city. So obviously God is not saying you're never going to have a home, but the idea of him being a fugitive and a wanderer is related to being hidden, or God's face being hidden from Cain. No favor, no presence of God, therefore a fugitive. Think about that. Cain is also convinced, right here, whoever finds me will kill me. Cain is convinced whoever finds him will kill him, but he and his parents are supposedly the only 3 humans we know about that are on the earth so far in the narrative. So this concern isn't even reasonable. Even if it's a future concern where people will say, well, Cain's thinking about his parents having other kids, they'll have descendants, and they're going to come after Cain for killing one of their family members, Abel. But that wouldn't really make much sense because Cain would have more than enough time to get away, build a life, make sure he's safe. So what is Cain, or who is Cain, really afraid of is the question. Also, for Cain to be hidden from God's face, or God's face to be hidden, means being outside of God's protection, being exposed, not safe. The question is, what is Cain no longer safe from? What is he in danger of? What is he exposed to when he's no longer in the presence of God like he is now? Which also brings up another question that I'll ask later. When it says right here that I'll be hidden from your face, and then verse 16 will go on to say that he'll be cast away from the presence of God. This means, and think with me here, this means currently at this point in the story, Cain and Abel, outside of the garden tree of life where Adam and Eve were, they're not yet exiled from the presence of God. They are not yet hidden from God's face and his favor. God's favor is still shining. At this point, before Cain kills Abel, Cain, Abel, mom and dad, that God's face is not hidden from them. God's favor is not hidden from them. Something to think about. They're actually, in some sense, still in proximity to the presence of God. Also, God's face of favor here. I know this is a lot about the face. It seems linked. Go back to verse 5 and 6. God will say, Cain, why is your face fallen? Which is to say, he's very angry. God's face of favor no longer shining on Cain seems to be connected to that idea of Cain being unfavorable towards Abel and killing him. And then a couple more things about verse 14. This sequence of events follows the same pattern in Genesis chapter 3. And you go, what do you mean? Well, desire creeps in. God says, whoa, buddy, sin is crouching at the door. Then Cain acts on that desire. After having a conversation with Abel, God calls Cain into question. Cain receives consequences, which is pretty much the exact pattern we see in Genesis chapter 3. Desire creeps in. There's a conversation that takes place. Eve acts on that desire. Adam follows suit. God responds to them, calls to them. There's consequences dealt. But in this specific situation, Cain responds differently to God's verdict than we see Adam and Eve, because in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve didn't even respond to the verdict. There's no, hey, this is Cain now, though, different. Cain is going, whoa, this is too much for me. This is too much for me to deal with. Something to think about, how the story has progressed to this point. Also, last thing about verse 14, I promise we'll move on, is that Cain seems to view this punishment as too much, because he's also mainly driven away from the face, favor, and presence of God, which I want you to see at the core of this story. Yes, murder and bloodshed and all that stuff, not good, but the focus is Cain is no longer in the presence, protection, favor of God. Verse 15, then the Lord said to him, not so, Cain. Right after Cain goes, someone could kill me. No, buddy, whoa, take it easy. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. Sevenfold. Seven. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Verse 15. Let's explore this. God says, now watch. I used to read this differently. The Lord put a mark on Cain. Here's why. Lest any people would attack him. It doesn't say to prevent the possibility of Cain being attacked. God doesn't promise Cain that he won't die or be attacked or killed. God does not guarantee Cain's safety. But God does promise and guarantee that whoever kills Cain would experience sevenfold consequences. And the mark God places on Cain is supposed to give that message to anyone who would try and take Cain's life. It's almost like a self-defense mechanism, but Cain does nothing. God's put the mark on Cain, so that anyone tries to sneak up on Cain got that mark, and they're like, whoa, I gotta think about this. If I take this dude's life, somehow I know sevenfold vengeance is gonna be taken on me. God doesn't deny Cain's concerns in this verse. God doesn't go, hey, whoa, buddy, no one's gonna attack you. Cain goes, whoever finds me will kill me. And God goes, not so. If anyone does, not that they would not, but if anyone does, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. Again, God does not guarantee Cain's safety and that he will not be murdered. Whatever mark God placed on Cain, everyone wants to speculate, what's the mark? What was it? Is it visible? It was a clear statement of sevenfold vengeance, that if they attacked Cain and took his life, this mark essentially is to decrease the chances of Cain being attacked. It doesn't absolutely prevent the possibility. It says lest they should, not that they wouldn't. So I don't believe we're supposed to read this as an absolute guarantee. The mark there is just like, hey, you do this, there's trouble for you, which should detour people, right? If you're smart, you probably don't want sevenfold vengeance. But also, before God exiles Cain, he marks him. Which, think about Genesis 3. Before God exiles Adam and Eve from the tree of life, he covers them. Cain doesn't deserve this mark. Cain doesn't deserve any help, any protection, anything from God, any assistance. Rather than sending Cain away empty-handed, though, with nothing, God gives him a mark he does not deserve. And that's important. Also, last thing about this mark is that God's mark on Cain did not mean God had favor toward Cain. Okay? Cain is being driven away from the favorable presence of God, but God still marks him. There's a seemingly, you might assume it's a physical, at least a visible mark. It's outward, obviously. Someone can see it, but is it physical? This mark does not mean God has favor on Cain. He had a degree of protection, but Cain was still exposed and vulnerable outside of God's favor. I think that's going to be important for the story of the Jewish nation as it develops. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. What is it that Cain leaves? What is he exiled from mainly? Well, he's cursed from the ground. He leaves the region of Eden. I don't believe God is restricted to some space and time, but he does go away from the presence of the Lord. And he settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain is specifically driven further east. Okay? In Genesis 3, we saw God put a cherubim and a flaming sword turning every way at the east of the garden. Now Cain is driven where? Further east. From Eden, where presumably Adam and Eve still live. In the region of Eden. Not in proximity to the tree of life, but it's the east, which is very important. This is the first time also we see a human living in a region outside of God's presence, outside of the region of Eden. This is the first time. Cain is, I can't think of the word right now. There seems to be a difference also between Cain being sent away from the tree of life versus Cain being sent away from the presence of God. Okay, Adam and Eve exiled from the tree of life, but Cain here specifically driven away from the presence of the Lord. Something to think about. All it means is Adam, Eve, and their children were still somehow near the presence of God. Now, Cain knew his wife, and whoa, wife? Oh, we're not even going to introduce, not even a name, not even, he found a woman. Just boom, Cain knew his wife. Who is she? Where'd she come from? What's happening? Lots of questions we'll probably explore in the next few sessions. Hold your questions. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So Cain presumably left the region of Eden alone. It doesn't say he had anyone with him. It doesn't say anyone at all except Cain left. Suddenly my guy has a wife in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Kind of odd. Also, Cain built an entire city. It didn't say he was alone in doing it, but he's at least credited with it. And you go, well, who else would be around? That's the question. If this is an entire city built just by one man, and again, the question becomes, well, technically, what qualifies as a city? If I build a 4-foot by 4-foot, wooden wall, and technically those are the walls of my city, is that a city? What qualifies as a city? It didn't say he was alone again, but he's credited with building it. If this is an entire city built just by one man, this is very impressive. But I think it's unreasonable to think that that's what happened. Depending on what qualifies as a city, again, even if Cain spent hundreds of years doing it with presumably the primitive technology available, everyone wants to speculate, and I don't know, technology might have been advanced. Cain, my guy, built a city by himself, but that doesn't seem as reasonable as saying Cain had some help, especially if he had a wife. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mahuhael. Have fun with these names. Mahuhael fathered Methusael, and Methusael fathered Lamech. Looking for hamster names? Just gave you like 4. And we'll get to verse 19 in a minute. The descendants of Cain don't seem to matter much until we get to some guy named Lamech. Okay, this guy, we get more detail about, and we get his story. Okay, for some reason, we need to know Lamech had 2 wives. One was named Adah and the other Zillah. No other details except the names of Irad, Mahuhael, Mathushael, and Enoch. Okay, just interesting, very interesting. That might mean, hey, pay attention to this guy. He's important for the story. Adah bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. Pause. Cain built a city. Yeah? But his future descendants, some of them end up dwelling in tents, which might assume wandering as nomads, being, wanderers, never truly settling. So it's interesting that Cain has a city, but some of his descendants presumably won't be living in that city. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre. You liar! And the pipe. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Okay, so we have a few interesting details that I'm circling in pink if you can see it. Okay, the dwelling in tents, the livestock, the lyre, the pipe, the bronze instruments, and iron. And this random sister of Tubal-Cain, Naamah. The focus of this portion of the story is that Lamech and his kids are credited with being the first to dwell in tents, own livestock. They're I can't think of the word where it's like they're the first to do it. Pioneers. They're pioneers, forging bronze and iron into tools. Lamech's children develop technology and innovate. But it's not stated. I want you to notice there is no statement from God about whether this is good or whether it's bad or whether it's neutral. Doesn't say where this knowledge or information or skill came from, if God, if somewhere else. Doesn't say. Just that these guys are credited with being the pioneers of these things. Also, there's an odd, seemingly out of place statement about Tubal-Cain's sister, or Lamech's daughter, Naamah. And then the Bible says nothing else about her, ever. Then right after this, Lamech speaks about a guy who wounded him and struck him, and he killed him and took vengeance. Right after this weird, random detail about a character that seems totally irrelevant. She's a pointless character, unless Naamah is related to what Lamech is about to say in verse 23. Pure speculation. I have nothing else except the fact that chronologically this speech happens after that detail. I don't think any connections at this point are out of the question. Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. This is Lamech raising his voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man. Well, who just killed a man in this story? Cain. For wounding me, but in this case it's vengeance. A young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Which means what? Obviously, the idea of Cain's revenge and the mark was passed down to generations. So, few things to say. Lamech is 5 generations removed from Cain. If you do the math, by this time there could be more people. Okay, but not so many people that Lamech wouldn't have known who this young man is. If he was a relative, it seems odd that he isn't referred to as such. So, just a question, where the heck did this young man come from? Just a random young man, not my second cousin, not my nephew, just this young man. There's a lot of odd details in this chapter about people that have no seeming connection to either Adam and Eve and their descendants. So, Lamech also tells this news to his wives. Pay attention to that. He goes, hear my voice, you wives. And you go, well, who else did he have to talk to? The rocks? His sheep? Well, possibly. But this is at least framed up as Lamech is intentionally and purposefully telling his wives this information as if they need to know what he's decided about the kind of revenge he can take. There are other people by now that he can tell this to, but for some reason, it's significant that he tells this to his 2 wives. Also, Lamech decides the revenge he can take. Did Cain decide the kind of revenge that could be taken for his life being taken? Nope, God decided that. God decided what Cain's revenge would be. Cain's revenge. What a great name for some kind of sauce, some kind of hot sauce. And Lamech has amplified Cain's revenge 10-fold or 11-fold, as if to make a statement about man's decline into further evil and how man is now taking the place of God, and man is now taking things into his hand and deciding these things rather than God. Also, we're not told how long Cain or any of his descendants ended up living. Look at the text. There's no years, there's no none of that. But the next chapter will be Adam, Seth, and all their descendants have years, as if to make a statement about Cain's line versus Seth's line, or the serpent's line versus the seed of the woman's line. Verse 25, the story comes back to Adam and Eve. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. You got all 3 of her kids right here. One happy family. To Seth also a son was born. He called his name Enosh. And at that time, the people began to what? Call upon the name of the Lord. Whereas, you focus the camera on Cain's line, you just got people murdering each other. Very different. So, the story doesn't come back to Adam and Eve until the story communicates the trajectory of Cain's descendants and their future. It's almost like the narrative wants you, the author wants you to know how Cain's line ended up working out. Let's see that play out. Then let's come back to Adam and Eve. So Eve isn't concerned. I want you to notice, Eve is not concerned with replacing Cain. You could assume a lot within her statement, but she's concerned with replacing Abel, not her firstborn. I mean, technically she lost both. Cain was exiled, Abel died. She says nothing about replacing her firstborn Cain, and I lost Cain. Her concern is replacing Abel, the secondborn who was murdered, the keeper of sheep. Also, last thing, it isn't until Enosh's generation that people begin to call upon the name of the Lord. For some reason. It might involve Enosh himself as being a part of that and him motivating that, but it's very interesting that calling upon the name of the Lord, it's not a frequent, common practice, or possibly not even a concept yet until Enosh comes on the scene, depending on how you define calling upon the Lord. Because they brought offerings, Cain and Abel, but was that calling upon the name of the Lord? What does that look like? I think when we look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that will make more sense. But next session is going to be all about questions. That will be a fun one. Make sure you pay attention to when that comes out. And that's all I got for you guys today. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough in Genesis chapter 4. What happens when you ask questions about the Bible? For example, in Genesis chapter 4, when Cain kills Abel, why did Cain and Abel bring an offering to God in the first place? Why was Cain's offering rejected for seemingly no clear reason in the text? Why is Cain afraid of being killed by people when presumably him and his parents are the only humans on the earth? For years, I did not know how to ask these kinds of questions when I studied the Bible. But these kinds of questions can take our understanding of the Bible to another level. So let's jump into Genesis chapter 4. Let's ask some questions about this text. Now, Adam knew Eve, his wife. What does it mean to know? Well, I think you're going to know what that means, because she conceives and she bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. You know, and you kind of credit God, but you're still like the main character. So, verse 1, why does the text tell us what Eve says about giving birth to Cain? There's nothing that's going to be said about Abel, and she bore his brother Abel. And she's not naming Cain per se in this statement. She's just making a statement about the fact that she has gotten a man who happens to be Cain. The question becomes, who names Cain? But when I say, why does the text give us a statement from Eve about Cain, I ask that because I also want to ask, how might this relate to the rest of the story and shed light on what might be happening in this story? Also, why is it specifically that Eve has gotten a man? Well, you go, well, because Cain is a man. This is the first human being born, through Eve, her womb, her first offspring. This is wonderful. She's going to make a big deal about it. Well, I just want to think about how this might relate to Genesis 3:16. Go read Genesis 3:16. And is this possibly her way? I'm just asking questions here, okay? Because it says in Genesis 3:16 that her desire will be contrary to her husband. And is this possibly, besides saying, whoa, I got a man, I produced an offspring, is this also a way for Eve to not need Adam in the picture, to produce on her own, and now she has her own man to oversee and rule? And some of you might think, well, that's a little too far, my friend. But when you look at what it is that's going to be, how Eve and Adam are now somewhat at odds in their relationship, and there's tension, and it's been fractured, you wonder if this is not just a statement about Cain, but a statement about Eve in relationship to just man. But I digress. Who named Cain and Abel? And you go, who cares? Because here's why I care. Because the text tells us when Adam names things. And so far in Genesis 2 and 3 specifically, there's no hiding the fact that Adam has the authority and the God-given ability to name the animals, and even woman, and then Eve in Genesis 3. So all of a sudden, Cain and Abel just have names. And I think that's intentional, to maybe make a deeper point about what's happening and the rift between Adam and Eve. But the text doesn't tell us who names. At the end, though, and you go, why is this important? Because at the end of this chapter, it will tell us Eve named Seth. Eve named Seth. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a worker of the ground. Okay? Two different fellas. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Okay? Question. Is it important to note that Cain is chronologically, are we seeing the events unfold? Is Cain the first to bring an offering, and then Abel follows? Because it says, and Abel also brought of the firstborn. And you go, well, possibly it could be both of them at the same time, but it starts with Cain as the main figure bringing the offering, and then it just tags on Abel. Not to say, and both brothers brought, Cain first, then Abel. Is that important? Possibly. Also, did God require them to bring offerings? You and I assume, looking back in hindsight, knowing the Levitical system and sacrifices and temple and Jesus, we're going, yeah, of course this was prescribed. It doesn't say that in the text, which doesn't mean it's not. But it's also probably making a statement about the fact that it's not important to know whether or not it was required or not. Just, did God require them to bring these offerings? I almost called them free will offerings. Or was this of their own free will? Did something prompt them to do this, or did God instruct them to do this? Something to think about. The way verse 2 transitions into verse 3, in the course of time, it makes it seem as though we don't see offerings up to this point. This may well be the very first offering of what someone has in God's world and bringing that to God. This may well be the first time that happens. So also, Abel brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. Gotta love them fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. His offering. If God did not explicitly instruct or command this offering, my question is, how did they know to do this? How did they know specifically to bring the fruit from the ground, or for Abel to bring the firstborn and the fat of his flock? And what compelled them to bring God gifts? And then the question becomes, if God chooses one and rejects another, let's just assume it's not arbitrary. There's a reason, there's a standard that one of them fails to meet. Then therefore, that might give us reason to conclude, possibly, that God did instruct this if there's a clear standard to meet, and a standard by which it'll be accepted or rejected. Also, again, were there any offerings up to this point? Because it just says, in the course of time. As if to make this, when I read it, it almost seems like a new thing. Otherwise, it would say, one time they brought an offering, or, one of the times they were bringing offerings, but this is, I'm reading this as, this is a brand new thing. Also, if this is a new, let's just say it's not a new thing at this point in human history. At this point in the narrative, we have not seen this concept of someone bringing an offering to God. Where did this come from? When was it established? Was this the product of sin? Like, is the offering as part of a way to deal with this issue of sin, and now this is what happens because of sin? Or was this part of the ideal and the way God created all things good, and offerings were part of that? How does the transition from exile in Genesis 3 to this story help us understand offerings being brought to God? Is this the result of exile? Is it a way to deal with exile and sin? Or is this, irregardless of the exile and sin, the way God intended for humans to relate to him, even in a good world? But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell, sunk in. Frustration, bitterness settling in, jealousy, grinding of the teeth. I'm reading a lot into that, but you know what I mean. Face falling as a result of anger. This is not a happy-go-lucky, hey, Abel, high five, buddy. This is, well, the question I have is, did God accept Abel's offering because he accepted Abel first? Or did God accept Abel because he accepted Abel's offering first? And the same question applies to Cain. Did God reject Cain because his offering was trash? Or did God reject the offering of Cain because Cain, not a great fella, and he had issues, and God rejected him in that moment? Is it that God starts with the person, then the offering? Or God starts with the offering, then the person? Either way, the offering is an extension of the person. For God to accept or reject one is to accept or reject the person offering it. So, something to think about. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry?" 4 words no one wants to hear when they're ticked off. I promise you that. And why has your face fallen? No one likes to be prodded when they're angry. Why are you mad? What happened? I don't want to talk to you right now, buddy. Get out of my face. So, verse 6. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? Does Cain actually, well, verse 7, sorry. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Obviously, Cain has an understanding of what God means, though for us, outsiders looking in, we're going, what does that mean? Will you not be accepted if you do well? If you don't do well, sin is crouching at the door. Oof. Its desires contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Several questions. Sin is crouching at the door, okay? Is sin only crouching at the door if Cain does not do well? Or is sin crouching at the door regardless of what Cain does, and God is just warning Cain, hey, do well because sin is crouching at the door or it will destroy you? In other words, this crouching at the door on the part of sin, is it conditioned upon Cain doing well or not doing well? Also, does Cain really have the ability to rule over sin in this situation? Or does God know Cain ultimately is powerless and helpless and he needs to call it to me? Or does God actually, has God given Cain the free will ability, the human ability to, in this moment, not let sin overtake him? That's going to divide. A lot of people will divide at that question. And your theology is showing. So why is this moment the first time we see sin explicitly referenced? Like, why didn't the previous story involve the word sin? Though the concept was there, the idea was underlying in that story. Why is this the first time the word sin is used? It's interesting, right? Verse 8, you're going to see that Cain didn't say a thing. God goes, hey, buddy, don't let your temper get the best of you. Cain doesn't say anything. Cain spoke to Abel. That's the next thing that happens. His brother. I'm just going to highlight this because I think it's important. He's not just speaking to another guy. No, he's an image bearer. He's not talking to his brother. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Twice, this verse wants to emphasize the fact that this was Cain's brother. So, question about Cain speaking to Abel. Did Cain speak to Abel before they were in the field? Or did Cain have this conversation with Abel in the field? And you go, that doesn't matter. Here's why I think it matters. These follow-up questions give us reason to ask that. Was this conversation the way that Cain lured Abel into the field to kill him? Was this conversation even supposed to happen? You know, Cain having this conversation with Abel, was that the wrong thing to do? Like, is this what it means for God when he tells Cain, hey, if you do well or if you don't do well, for Cain to not do well, does it mean he's having this conversation with Abel? Is he already like kind of, I don't know, messing himself up by having this conversation? All I'm going to say is this conversation before the decision to sin seems reminiscent of Eve and the serpent in Genesis 3. And I'm just wondering, are we supposed to see that connection? Are we supposed to see that connection? Is this conversation even supposed to happen? Is this the way Cain is choosing to not do well, and he's letting sin overtake him, and he's luring Abel into the field where he's going to kill him? Questions I have about this text. Also, right after God speaks to Cain, Cain says nothing. He's silent. The next thing he does is he goes to speak to Abel instead of talking to God. Instead of having a conversation with God, he goes and talks to Abel. Is that revealing something deeper about what's happening in this story? Is that revealing or emphasizing anything in particular? Should Cain have taken, voiced and expressed his concern and frustration to God rather than having a conversation with Abel? Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel? Because we know he rose up against his brother and killed him. Where's Abel? And we know that God knows. He's not looking for new information. I truly don't know. I have lost Abel. He said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Pause. The narrative did not state that God was elsewhere or that he came to Cain, though that's assumed within the text. You go, well, God wouldn't just allow that to happen or be there. I just want to point out the fact that it transitions from God talking to Cain, or rather, Cain killing Abel, to all of a sudden, God is talking to Cain. Then the Lord said, suddenly he's just talking to Cain. Is this intentional? When we compare this story with how God approached Adam and Eve after their failure in Genesis 3, is there something different that's taking place? And if so, what's the deeper point being made with the fact that God just suddenly is talking to Cain? And the Lord said, what have you done? The only person God told that to in Genesis chapter 3, just fact-checking myself, is Eve. Genesis 3. What have you done? Interesting. Never really caught that. But I don't want to get off track. I guess I will keep going. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. This narrative has God asking two questions to Cain. And you go, two questions. Well, the first one, he said in verse 5 or 6, why has your face fallen? Second one, where is your brother? I guess technically, this would be 3. Where's Abel? What have you done? So I'm just going to focus on these two questions. You're like, he's making this up as he goes. Kind of, somewhat. I have notes. These two questions. Where's Abel? What have you done? Those are two questions that God asked Adam and Eve separately. In Genesis 3, God said, Adam, where are you? To Eve, he said, what have you done? Now, in this narrative, both these questions are being directed at Cain, and they're combined. And I'm just saying, is that significant? Is this revealing a kind of digression or progression in the story compared to the previous story with Adam and Eve? Also, why does God hear the voice of Abel's blood rather than Abel's voice? Is there a difference? And if so, what's the distinction between the two ideas? And you go, well, the blood is an extension of Abel. You know, the lifeblood is the life of the person. But why didn't he just say, I hear your brother crying out from the ground? What does it emphasize when he says the blood of Abel? And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. It's kind of weird. Isn't the ground, first of all, okay, isn't the ground already cursed because of Adam? Genesis 3 told us that the ground is now cursed, but he says now you are cursed from the ground, right? And then here's what I want to highlight about the ground, okay? Cain is cursed from the ground. Also, the ground has opened its mouth to receive Abel's blood. Also, when you work the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. There's a lot of conversation about this ground, right? Seems kind of odd. But isn't the ground already cursed because of Adam? So what does it mean for a man to be cursed from the ground? Is it important to note that Cain is cursed from the ground, which is the same ground that produced the fruit he brought? Because the chapter, or what was it, verse 3, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Are we supposed to see those two ideas as being related? The ground he brought his fruit from is now the ground that has soaked up the blood of Abel, and the ground that Cain is now cursed from. Are all these ideas colliding? This is giving us, I guess, a clearer picture of why God rejected Cain and his offering. Also, in verse 12, he says, "You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." What does it mean for Cain to be a fugitive and a wanderer? And sometimes we have questions. We'll just keep reading and it'll get answered, but something to think about. Verse 13, Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." Does this question indicate that Cain had no real sorrow or remorse for his sin? Because he's only concerned with his punishment being too much. It's greater than I can handle. That's all he's concerned with. Also, what does it mean for his punishment to even be greater than he can bear? What does that mean? In his mind, how does he understand that? And I think as we get to verse 14 in the next video, there's going to be a lot more questions that we have, especially when Cain is going to say something like, well, what if someone finds me? And we're going to save that question for the next session. Make you guys wait a little bit. So, thanks for watching today's video. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough here in Genesis chapter 4. The most important thing we can do when we read the Bible is learn to ask the right questions. For example, in Genesis chapter 4, when Cain kills Abel, where did Cain's wife even come from, and how did he build an entire city? Because the only humans alive, presumably, are Cain and his parents. And why are we told about Tubal-Cain's sister, Naamah, and then we never see her again? See, for years, I did not know how to ask the right questions when I studied the Bible. But these kind of questions can take our understanding of Scripture to another level. So let's jump into Genesis chapter 4. So let's ask some questions, starting in verse 14, if you haven't watched the other message, all about how to ask the right questions, starting in verse 1, going to verse 13. Go watch that. You don't have to, but it is helpful. Verse 14, okay, this is Cain answering God after receiving the consequences for his sin. "Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." This is Cain somewhat overwhelmed and concerned with what it is that God just told him. When Adam and Eve were exiled, okay, they were not hidden from God. Go read the text. Genesis 3 says that they were removed from the tree of life. The tree of life was guarded so that they could not access that. Okay, I believe what Cain is experiencing here is something new. He's the first human being to experience this, being hidden from the face of God. Now, whether or not you want to just chalk that up to something metaphorical and say, well, that's not a literal thing. That's a figurative idea. The face of God representing His favor. God is withholding that from Cain now. I guess my question becomes, what is the difference between the idea in this story where Cain is hidden or from the face of God versus when Adam and Eve are exiled from the tree of life? What is the difference between those two ideas and stories? Also, why is Cain driven away from two things? If you think about it, thinking about Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve were only driven away from the tree of life, specifically. But here, Cain is driven away from the ground and second thing, from the face of God, he's hidden. Also, there seems to be a fear on the part of Cain. Whoever finds me will kill me. He's already said, if anyone finds me, it's guaranteed. I'm done. Okay, my life is over. Is this fear of being murdered is that a new idea? Is that a new feeling that we see in Cain? Of course, in the story, we have not seen this quite yet. We do see the warning to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in Genesis 3, and that death would ensue from that. But here there's this fear that if anyone finds me, I'm going to die. And so, my question is, has Cain up to this point had no reason to fear having his life taken, since he's had some proximity to God and was under God's favor and protection there in the region of Eden? Also, why does Cain believe that whoever will find him will kill him? Why isn't it just that, someone might find me? Why is it that they will kill me? It's like an understood fact. It's absolutely going to happen. Does this have to do with vengeance? Does this have to do with the concept of vengeance being taken on Cain for Abel's life being taken? Also, if this is the fact, how does Cain intuitively understand this idea of vengeance? How is that a concept that he understands up to this point? When would there have been the need to know what vengeance is and what that looks like? Of course, you can look at God dealing with Adam and Eve and the serpent in Genesis 3 and dealing consequences, but I wouldn't say that's the kind of vengeance that Cain is specifically speaking of and he's afraid of. Also, who does Cain think will find him? If presumably Cain and his parents are the only 3 human beings alive on the earth, why is he convinced that there are people who, if they find him, they will kill him? Something to think about. Also, the ground here, Cain being driven away from the ground because God says cursed is the ground. Is this ground that Cain is referring to, is this all the ground across the earth when God says cursed is the ground? Or is God just talking about the ground that Cain has been dwelling in right outside of Eden, right outside of that initial place where Adam and Eve were? Is it just a specific kind of ground, or is this the ground all across the planet? Is the ground outside of Eden somehow more special and sacred than, say, the ground across the rest of the earth, at least in the narrative of Scripture and where we're at in the story? Also, second to last question, just about verse 14. I know there's a lot of questions I'm throwing your way. This sequence of events, okay, when I think about what has transpired up to this point, there's a pattern. Desire creeps in. Cain becomes jealous. He wants to kill Abel. There's anger. And then a conversation happens. Cain acts on that desire. He takes life. And then God actually calls Cain into question and questions him. Where are you? What have you done? And then he receives the just consequences. Okay, we've seen that exact pattern in Genesis chapter 3 with Adam and Eve. Same exact pattern, same exact components. Except in this specific situation, Cain responds to God's consequences, whereas Adam and Eve are silent in Genesis 3. They do not respond to God's verdict. And my question is that important for us to recognize? That there's a contrast between this story, which is the same pattern we see in Genesis 3, versus what actually happened in Genesis 3. Cain versus Adam and Eve. And the fact that Cain answered God, Adam and Eve did not. Are we supposed to note that difference? And if so, what does that highlight about this specific situation and where the story has gotten to up to this point? Also, the last question about verse 14, I promise. Does Cain view the real punishment as the fact that he has a worse relationship with the ground, or is the real consequence that he's driven away from the presence of God? And you go, it doesn't say driven away from God's presence. Actually, in verse 16, Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. So that explicit language will be used. Then the Lord said to him, not so. So the question is God answering Cain's concern that he will die? Or is God answering Cain's, I guess, where Cain's at? He's like, if someone finds me, they're definitely going to kill me. And God's going, no. If someone finds you, they most definitely, that's not going to be the case. That's not an absolute fact. Which one is God answering here when he says, not so? Watch what he says. If anyone kills Cain, it doesn't say no one will kill Cain. It says, if that happens, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold, which means God is answering the concern that Cain has, which is that if anyone finds me, they'll definitely kill me. And God's going, not necessarily. God is not guaranteeing that Cain will not die. He's actually stating that just because someone finds you doesn't mean you're absolutely going to die. different people might have different motives and have different intentions, and different things will happen. But either way, God says vengeance will be taken sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain. This mark is related to the sevenfold judgment and God answering Cain's concern. If someone finds me, they're definitely going to kill me. I'm going to put a mark on you, Cain, lest any who finds you should attack you. Which, here's my question. Number one, what is the mark that God places on Cain? Obviously, it's visible. Obviously, something someone can recognize and go, hold on. That looks like a warning to me. And why does this mark give a clear statement of sevenfold vengeance to anyone who would find Cain and think, I'm going to kill this guy? Why would they get a clear statement from that mark that I should probably stay back from this guy? Does this mean that the mark was visible is a question I have also. Who would be the one inflicting the vengeance is the question I have. Because God just says vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. It doesn't say who will be the one inflicting the judgment, or the vengeance rather. You and I would assume, well, God is overseeing that for sure, but it doesn't say God is the one directly dealing personally that vengeance upon a person. There might be a way, a medium through which God brings that vengeance upon that person. So who's the one inflicting the vengeance? You might say on behalf of God. If anyone took Cain's life, would it be God, another human being? Would it be another human being on behalf of God? Also, is Cain being driven from the ground? Is that part of the vengeance being taken upon him for shedding Abel's blood? When we look at how Cain took Abel's life, and there's a dimension of Abel's blood is crying out for justice, is part of the rightful just consequence that Cain is driven from the ground? And if so, does that mean that is actually a kind of vengeance being taken upon Cain for shedding Abel's blood? Something to wrestle with when it comes to our understanding of God's justice and the way he, brings retribution and such. Also, if this is something we can conclude and go, it seems as though it's a kind of vengeance that is being taken on Cain based on him taking Abel's life, then if that's so, does this mean that the kind of vengeance that would come upon Cain's killer would be that not necessarily their life is taken, but it would be a different kind of sevenfold vengeance? In other words, if what we're looking at when Cain is driven away from the ground and driven from the presence of God, if that is a kind of vengeance, then it would make sense that the kind of vengeance taken on Cain's killer would be similar. And if not, then the question becomes, what kind of vengeance is in mind here? We assume something. Well, he takes life, so their life is taken. Verse 16. I'm just trying to show you that maybe our assumptions and our default understanding is not always actually the proper interpretation. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, and he settled in the land of Nod. And this place is east of Eden, which is very important. Okay? Cain is the first person to be sent away from the presence of the Lord. We don't see that with Adam and Eve. We see them cut off from the tree of life. The fact that he's driven away from the presence of the Lord assumes what? Assumes that at that time, before he killed Abel and these consequences were dealt, at that time, both him and his parents were all in the presence of the Lord. Otherwise, there's no real punishment here. You're cut off from God's presence. I already was. My dad's Adam, but that's not happening. So does this mean that Adam and Eve were not sent away from God's presence, but they were actually only exiled from the garden tree of life? Also, why is the land specifically east of Eden? It seems like an unnecessary detail. Well, it's like, oh, it's cool to know where Cain's going. Well, in relation to Eden, that's important apparently. What does this highlight about the story? What does this highlight about the narrative progression and how the story is developing from Genesis chapter 3? Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, this he, being Cain, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. We're going to see another special Enoch come from Seth's line. But my question is, where the heck did this wife come from? Who is this wife? Where'd she come from? Was she already in the land of Nod? Was she a descendant of Adam and Eve, and she's a kind of sister to Cain? Or is this one of the children of Adam and Eve that ends up coming later, and then she grows up And Cain goes, now I have a wife. And then he marries her when she's older after being alone for so long. Where'd she come from? Everyone has their thoughts and theories. Also, how does Cain build an entire city on his own? And you and I go, what qualifies as a city? Technically, it could have been like a really tiny home with some walls around it. Bam, you got yourself a city. Well, I'm not going to go there actually. Is Cain even building this city by himself is a question I have. What qualifies as a city? What is required for it to be a legitimate city in the biblical story, according to the definition they're working with? Also, what does it reveal that Cain names an entire city after his firstborn son? I want you to think about that. What does this reveal about Cain and where he's at now after some time has apparently transpired? Has a wife, has a son, builds a city. That's not going to happen in a week unless he's got some crazy technology, which some people would think that. But apart from that, we're going, some time has transpired. What does it reveal about where Cain possibly is now? The fact that he's naming the city after his son. To Enoch was born Irad. I'm going to butcher these names. Judge me all you want. And Irad fathered Mahuhael. Mahuhael fathered Methusael. And Methusael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives. Nothing about Methusael, Mahuhael, or Irad, or Enoch, except the cities named after him. All of a sudden, Lamech, 5 generations from Cain, we have something about this fella. He took 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, the name of the other Zillah. Why does it matter that Lamech took 2 wives? Why is that a detail we need to know? Why is that significant as it relates to what's happening in this story? Also, Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. He'll have some descendants too. But why does it matter that these descendants are dwelling in tents, that some of them are having livestock? It says he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. It assumes, at least from my understanding, presumably dwelling in tents and having livestock is something new and innovative, a new idea. And so are these descendants dwelling in tents within the city or outside the city? When you see dwelling in tents, usually you think nomad, wandering, sojourners. So if there's a city Cain built, then why are they outside the city, presumably? Also, why are these details important to share as it relates to Cain and his descendants? Go on, and it'll say Jubal was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. So we have some interesting details about his descendants. Why are these important? Bronze instruments. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain. This Tubal-Cain was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. Okay, so why are these details important? Bronze instruments, iron instruments, musical instruments, livestock, dwelling in tents. What does this reveal about Cain's descendants and where his line has gone? Also, what kind of instruments are these supposed to be? The forger of instruments, these bronze and iron instruments. Musical instruments, agricultural instruments, weapons, practical tools for everyday life. And then the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Who is Naamah, besides being the sister of Tubal-Cain? Why do we care? Why does the story briefly mention her, only to never mention her again? What is her significance? And is she related, possibly, to the next couple of verses, where Lamech is going to say, a man struck me, a man wounded me, and I killed him? Is there possibly overlap? Lamech said to his wives, remember, my guy has 2 wives. He says, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I've killed a man. Oh, yeah, he wounded me. A young man, actually. Oh, yeah, he struck me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, which obviously that was passed down, then Lamech's is 70-fold. Interesting. He gets to decide that all of a sudden. Lamech is 5 generations removed from Cain. By this time, there could be more people, but not so many people that Lamech wouldn't have known who this young man is if he was a relative of this young man. It just seems odd that this nameless young man isn't referred to as any kind of relative. So my question is, where did this young man come from? Why is he important? Why is this important as it relates to Naamah, the sister of Tubal-Cain being named right before this, which seems to have some connection. Also, why does Lamech tell his wives specifically these things? What's his intent? What's his motive? What is he trying to prompt in them? Is he trying to get them to respond a certain way? And then Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, called his name Seth. First he said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. You'd have some bitterness towards him too. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. And at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Well, question. Why does it transition from Lamech to Adam and Eve? Why does the genealogy of Cain not go any further? Why does it stop at Lamech? And then all of a sudden we're back to Adam and Eve and Seth. Why is it important that Eve named Seth? Adam knew his wife, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. She being the one, presumably, that calls him Seth. So why is it important to know that Eve named Seth versus, in the beginning of this chapter, the text doesn't say whether or not Adam or Eve named Cain or Abel. And you go, obviously, one of them is going to name Cain or Abel, but the text doesn't specify. From my understanding, intentionally, as on purpose, that those details aren't known. This doesn't mean that neither of them named Cain and Abel. Obviously, they had a part in it, but it's just not clearly stated, which I believe is significant when we compare that with Seth. If the text wants to specify that Adam and Eve named their son, or Eve named her son, or Adam named his son, the text up to this point has no problem doing that. But it's silent on Cain and Abel, and then it's loud when Seth comes on the scene. Also, is it significant, just when we think about the fact that Eve is the one calling Seth his name, is it significant that in Genesis 1 and 2, or rather 2, we have Adam naming all the animals, and then Adam naming woman, and then Genesis 3, Adam names his wife Eve. Up to this point, besides God, Adam's the only one who calls things different names, and all of a sudden Eve steps in here in Genesis 4. Is it significant to notice that Eve named Seth? But Seth actually is the one who names his son Enosh. Also, what does it mean to call upon the name of the Lord? That might be something important to understand. Is this a new idea? If this was a new concept and something that had not yet been done up to this point, why was this not a frequent thing? And if it was a frequent practice, why is it not stated? Also, last two questions. The people here, at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Does this also include people from the line of Cain? Are people in Cain's line also calling upon God's name, or is this just people who descend from Seth? Is this other people? Who are these people? Who are these people? It doesn't say Enosh's descendants or Seth's descendants, or it doesn't specify, just people. Who is around to be calling upon God's name 2 generations from Adam and Eve? Is there a contrast here taking place between those who call upon the name of God versus those who take vengeance on their enemies 77-fold? You know, this contrast between the line of Seth versus the line of Cain, or the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. Are we to see that contrast? Those who are calling upon God's name versus those who are essentially taking his name in vain by killing people made in his image. So something to think about. That concludes our session on questions. In the next episode, we will continue talking about Genesis 4, and we'll talk about its literary context. So we'll read the story in light of the stories that come before it, make some connections, draw up some patterns. It'll be cool. So make sure you guys stay tuned for that one, and I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. We're told to read things in context when we study the Bible. But what does that even mean? Part of this means noticing how the current passage relates to what came before it. For example, there are some key connections between the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3 and the murder of Abel in Genesis chapter 4. Cain seems to amplify the sin of his parents. Cain's punishment seems to be amplified from his parents in Genesis chapter 3. And Eve seems to confirm what God said would happen between her and her husband in Genesis chapter 3. And there are other connections just like this that we need to pay attention to. So let's jump into Genesis chapter 4, and we'll look at these deeper connections together. A few things to note as we jump into how this relates to the previous chapters and the stories that come before this, which is only 3 chapters, so it shouldn't be that hard. But a few things to note. You're going to see some words in this chapter in particular that are reminiscent of previous chapters. So pay attention to words like help, work, working, workers, fruit, ground, desire, contrary, rule, field, taking, took, and curse. Now those words might sound weird at first. Also, you're going to see some ideas that relate to these words somewhat, but those are words I want you to pay attention to depending on the translation that you have and the version that you're reading. Some ideas that are going to be reminiscent of previous chapters is when God will ask, where is or where are you? What have you done? God will say that something is cursed. You'll see the face of both Cain and God in this passage. Someone going away, the presence of God, man and the ground, and man going into the ground, and then creeping beasts of the field that want to pounce and are waiting to pounce upon humanity. I know that sounds weird. As I say these ideas and words, you're like, what the? As we get through this and we finish this session, that will make more sense. When you read Genesis 4, there's some brand new ideas we have not seen. And that's very important to notice as you're reading through Scripture. Go, I've actually never seen these ideas before. This is new. Pay attention to that. So you're going to see these ideas are brand new. We have not seen these ideas in these first 3 chapters of Genesis. The keeper of sheep, sexual relations between man and woman, offering of fruit, offering of fat portions, human anger, sin crouching to attack, murder and bloodshed, blood crying from the ground swallowing up blood, image bearers being cursed, someone being a fugitive and a wanderer, someone receiving greater punishment than they can handle, someone being hidden from God's face, a man seeking revenge, 7-fold revenge, a mark on a person, someone being sent away from God's presence, someone settling in a foreign land, a city being built, 2 wives for 1 man, kind of weird, someone dwelling in tents and having livestock, musical instruments and bronze instruments. These are ideas that all of a sudden in Genesis 4, bam, here we are. We've never seen these things. And when you see all these things together, you go, this chapter is pivotal in the biblical story, as are many chapters. But let's start reading. Now, Adam knew Eve. And if you're like, what ideas, what words, what did you just say? In future weeks and months, we'll have these exact documents that I'm reading from compiled and easy for you to download off the website so you can look at it yourself. Now, Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. Here's what Eve says. I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Who has? Eve says, I have. Of course, with God's help. You know, when you kind of give God credit for stuff. So, question. When it comes to Eve saying, I've gotten a man, and then we look in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. And God will say, your desire will be contrary to your husband, to Eve, as part of her consequence. Are these 2 ideas possibly related? The idea of Eve getting a man on her own and being able to essentially produce man, not without Adam, but having her own man to kind of oversee and have come from her, is that part of what it looks like for Adam and Eve to have a kind of tense, tension in their fractured marriage? Is that a part of the idea? Also, in verse 1, it says that she conceived and bore Cain, and then all of a sudden she bore his brother Abel. We do not see specifically either Adam or Eve or both of them name Cain and Abel. Is that intentional? Is that very important for us to understand? And I would say the answer is yes. Because in Genesis chapter 2, thinking about when God allows Adam to name the animals, or when God allows Adam to name woman, or in Genesis 3 when Adam names his wife Eve, Adam has a lot of responsibility and authority from God to name things. And in the end of this chapter, you're going to see Eve will be credited with naming Seth, her 3rd-born son, at least according to Scripture. So the text doesn't have any problem with telling us when Adam and Eve name things. But in this situation, it just says Cain and Abel, here they are, bam. And I want us to be thinking about if that's important to the narrative. Also, Adam and Eve here producing an offspring, Cain and Abel together. It's linking back to the original mandate in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 when God commissions man and woman to be what? Fruitful and multiply. and how God brought Adam to his wife. God brings Eve to Adam. So we're supposed to be thinking of that all as background information as we get to chapter 4. God brought Adam his wife. He told them be fruitful and multiply. Bam, they're being obedient. We don't know how long it's taken or how much time has transpired. Also, this is the first human, apparently, that's been produced from woman, that it's actually listed in Scripture. Some want to speculate that there were people before this. Adam and Eve came, they had children before this, but at least here in the text, the first listed chronologically person to be produced from Eve and Adam is Cain. We've seen things produced up to this point in Genesis 1 and 2, like trees producing fruit, plants producing after themselves, the land producing all the plants, the ground producing man. But up to this point, we have not seen woman produce. This is new. This is new. Though it was part of God's original mandate to be fruitful and multiply. All right. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep. And Cain here, I want to focus on, he was a worker of the ground. Now, if you go back to Genesis 2 in particular, 2, Cain's job here is to work the ground, which now, after Genesis 3's curse on the ground, we know the ground Cain is working with is cursed because of his father Adam. So Cain is working a ground that produces thorns and thistles and was cursed by Adam's sin. God originally made man to work the ground and rule over creation under God's authority. And Cain here is doing one of those things. Cain here is working the ground as part of the original calling on man to work and cultivate and till the ground and produce. And then you have Abel doing the other half of the mandate. Remember, be fruitful and multiply, cultivate, expand, rule, govern, all that stuff. So essentially, Cain's doing the working part, and then you'll have Abel doing the ruling, overseeing, and governing the animals part. Abel's governing the sheep. He's a sheep keeper, which has a dimension, or is a dimension of the original call to govern and be fruitful and multiply. Abel's ruling over the animals. Cain here's working the ground. It's as if they both come together to form the full picture of what, well, apart from procreation, of what man was commissioned to do under God's authority. Of course, not in the ideal conditions right now. But in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord, sorry, I'm reading the screen, brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. And you're going to see he did not have that same regard for Cain. So Cain is offering. Let's think about this. What we know about the ground up to this point is it's been cursed. Ground produces things, plants, trees, even the animals came from the ground. Man came from the ground. You're going to see at the end of this, the ground soaks up the blood of Abel, which is ironic. And then you're going to, if you pay attention, the ground also produces thorns and thistles. So with all of that background information, we know the kind of ground that Cain is working. Cain is offering to God what comes from the cursed ground by this time, okay? It's what comes up with thorns and thistles, but what Cain is offering, supposedly, is the good, edible part of what comes from the ground, the fruit. So the last story of the fall of man took a negative turn because of forbidden fruit that human beings ate. That was off limits, and they ate that fruit. And immediately after that story, now we have a man offering fruit to God. And I just want you to think about those two stories being compared to each other. Also, we see no original command or instruction. If you read Genesis 1 all the way through 3, you won't see any command or instruction explicitly to bring God offerings of fruits or animals or fat, which doesn't make this wrong, and it doesn't mean God didn't instruct them or it wasn't a part of the ideal. It's not something we've seen. It's not something that God has up to this point instructed clearly. Also, there seems to be this new idea of bringing an offering to God. So we ask questions like, where did this come from? When was it established? Why was it established? Why were Cain and Abel compelled to do this? And then thinking about how the last story ended with exile and eating forbidden fruit and rebellion, how does this story transition from the exile story? And that transition, how does that help us understand how we should think of offerings that are brought to God? When I look at Cain and Abel bringing offerings to God, okay? If I'm to see this as a result, possibly, of the fall, and as coming after the fall, how would that help me understand what might be going on? Again, that doesn't mean God did not originally intend for this in the ideal at all. We're just working with what the text gives us. Verse 5, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. God had no regard for Cain and his offering. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. That'd be like one of my kids bringing me a drawing, and I'm like, this is amazing, and I hang it up, and the other kid brings it, and I go, try again, buddy. Whoa, that would destroy them. It would destroy them emotionally. So God accepting Abel's offering here, I want you to note, that is God having favor towards Abel and his offering, okay? Which this favor is something Cain did not receive. Cain grew jealous that his brother had approval and favor that Cain did not. Now, what this didn't mean that there was no favor left for Cain. There was more than enough if Cain did well. We're going to see in the next verse. Won't you be accepted if you do well? So I want you to think about how Genesis 3 started. The serpent comes in, starts lying to Eve, deceiving her. Then she gives the fruit. After eating it herself, she gives it to Adam. But it starts with a serpent, cunning, wanting to usurp and stand above God's image bearers in the earth. And human beings are the pinnacle of God's creation in the earth. Who did God entrust to rule and steward and cultivate the planet to? He entrusted that to man, humanity. So the serpent, it seems reminiscent of how the serpent sees God's favor on humanity and how God made humanity in his image. And the serpent appears to have a bad eye towards God and the favor he gave to man. And just like the serpent took out that frustration and jealousy on people by leading them into death by deception, so Cain will take out his frustration and jealousy upon Abel by taking his life, because Abel had a station and favor that Cain was jealous of, which again seems very comparable to how the serpent seems to evaluate humanity in Genesis 3. Also, this situation is different than Genesis 3's sin. Okay, let's think about this. God comes to Cain. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? Okay, there's that initial rage being built up in Cain. God answers, comes to him and goes, if you do well, essentially you'll be accepted. If you don't, sin is crouching at the door. And you need to know something about sin. It's contrary to you. It actually, just like we see the desire in Genesis 2, Eve's desire is contrary to her husband. Same exact phrasing, except it's sin now that's in that slot, having contrary desire to Cain and what's good for him. Okay, but God goes, you have to rule over that. So this situation is different than Genesis 3's story of sin with the fall of man. See, God talks to Cain before he sins, not just after. God speaks with him in between that initial desire and the action of sin. God did not do that with Adam and with Eve in Genesis 3. And I want you just to think about, just meditate on why that might be. How the story has progressed to this point now, where we're about to see that same story in Genesis 3 on repeat, but it's through Cain now. And God is going to step in and talk to Cain before he does it, as a sort of preventative. Also, we've seen this idea of ruling over something in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. God commissioned man to rule over the animals and the earth as part of their calling. So maybe this idea of ruling over sin is actually related to that. God made man to rule and to govern under God's authority, like Abel is doing with sheep, right? Abel is ruling over the sheep, keeping sheep, watching the sheep. So Cain now has an opportunity to do that same thing. But instead of with animals, he now has the opportunity to rule the animalistic instincts and appetites that are crouching at his door to take over him. And it's not a coincidence that sin here is likened to a predator. It seems as though this would be a part of the offering that to God that Cain could offer God. Because we think, well, what could Cain bring? Abel has the sheep, Cain's got the fruit. Poor guy's working with the cursed ground. What does he have to bring? I think this right here gives you insight into that. What Cain can bring to God, part of that at least, the offering of ruling over that desire to give in to jealousy and kill Abel. That would have been part of the offering. At least that's how I see it. It wasn't just a thing to bring God, but a heart posture, an attitude, a way of doing things, exercising self-control and discipline, and respecting the image of God in Abel. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel, and he killed him. So just thinking about Genesis 1 through 3, up to this point, God has given life. God brings life. God creates life. And now, humans who have God's life energy and life breath, humans, Cain, are taking life. Rather than partnering with God in promoting life and human flourishing, we have Cain working against that ideal. Okay, thinking about how life works. Also, there's a conversation that takes place before Cain actually kills Abel in the field. Okay, and the questions I have around this is, did the conversation take place in the field, outside the field? Was the conversation right before the murder? Because all I'm saying is, when we look at Genesis 3 and the fall of man there, which is going to be on repeat throughout human history, this seems reminiscent of Genesis 3 when Eve and the serpent are having a conversation. And right after that, Eve reaches and takes and sins. And right here we have a conversation taking place. And right after, Cain's going to reach out with his hand and take the life of Abel. And are we supposed to see that connection? I believe so. Also, sin's desire being contrary to Cain, like I said, it relates to Genesis 3:16 when Eve is told her desire will be contrary to her husband. Or as I've been told in the comments, you guys have told me that in the King James, it says her desire is for her husband, which I think communicates the same essential core meaning, which is that it is against the ideal within that marriage covenant relationship. Also, this conversation takes place before the decision to sin, just as Eve, again, had that conversation with the serpent before she sinned, and then the conversation Adam has with Eve, well, I wouldn't say conversation, but it seems as though he's present when Eve gives him the fruit. I don't know what he heard. I don't know how much he heard between Eve and the serpent, if he heard any of that. But these are just correlations that we're noticing. There's a pattern, okay? The sin is described as an animal lying in wait to seize its prey. Sin is crouching, and Cain here is actually in the field, rising up against his brother. This rising up assumed a lower position, which could assume Cain is in that crouching position himself. Maybe not literally, but his heart, his life, his action right now is one of, I am about to pounce on Abel. And so essentially, Cain is allowing himself to be used as a vessel for sin. Not only has he given in to sin and given into that desire, and he's made preparations, it seems as though he draws Abel into the field to kill him, but he's now going to do what takes life, and sin will bring death through Cain. And this is what we see about the serpent in Genesis 3. He's cunning, he's crafty, he lies in wait, he's a beast of the field, he's waiting to take life, he comes to steal, kill, and destroy, all these different things we know. But the idea is that Cain here is embodying the ways of the serpent. He's imitating the serpent and even sin itself, using Cain as a vessel to take Abel's life. And I think this is where we see that promise in Genesis 3 that we're thinking about when God tells the serpent, your offspring will be at odds with the woman's offspring, and her offspring will crush your head, and you'll bite his heel, and all that seed war is playing out right here. Right here, we have the seed of the serpent coming against the seed of the woman. The irony about both people here, though, is that they both come from man. They're both image bearers of God, but one embodies the snaky ways of the serpent, and the other one is a victim, and even likened to a martyr when Jesus speaks of the blood of righteous Abel, all the way down to the blood of Zechariah. So, a few connections to make. I don't want to overload you. I'm going to break this down into another session, and we're going to continue in verse 9 and then finish the chapter all the way through as we continue examining connections to the rest of the first 3 chapters of Genesis, which I think are going to be really cool and really helpful for you. So let me know in the comments what stood out to you. I haven't said this before, but I'm going to start doing this. Let me know in the comments what stood out to you, what you saw, what questions you might have, maybe some things you noticed that I didn't. Let's come together and let's share our thoughts and our insights in the comments, all right? Other than that, I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough as we continue unpacking Genesis chapter 4. Real quick, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you at abovereproachministry.com. Go to the website or click the links in the description below to check out all of our free Bible study resources. We have online Bible classes, devotional studies, Bible study workshops, all of my sermon notes, and more. You can even join our online church community on the Discord app. We also have discussion groups all around the world, and if you don't see one in your area, message me and we'll help you start a launch group. I personally lead a group in Spartanburg, South Carolina. If you live in the area, we'd love to have you join us on Fridays for Bible study. So contact me if you're interested, and if you or your church would like me to come preach or teach, just message me or shoot me an email and we'll see what we can do, because I love preaching in person. If you're a new follower of Jesus, click the New Believers section to access everything we recommend for new believers. And be sure to snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, to support this ministry. All right, that's all I got for you. Let's jump back into the video. We are told to read things in context when we study the Bible. But what does this even mean? Part of this means knowing how the current passage relates to what came before it. For example, there are some key connections between the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3 and the murder of Abel in Genesis chapter 4. We see that Cain amplifies the sin of his parents. We see that Cain receives worse consequences than his parents in Genesis chapter 3. And then we see a call back to the ground that Adam came from, but this time, the ground is soaking up the blood of Abel. See, these connections will forever change the way you see Genesis chapter 4. Jump into Genesis 4, you're going to see these ideas and these keywords come up again. I want you to pay attention to them, and I want you to know what to look for. So some similar words reminiscent of the first 3 chapters. The word help, worker, fruit, ground, desire, contrary, rule and dominion, a field, taking, took, and then the curse. And then there's ideas that are reminiscent of the previous chapters as well, such as when God says, "Where are you?" or "Where is Abel?" rather. "What have you done?" God says to Cain. Curse, you'll see the curse that God extends to Cain. You see the face of both God and Cain, as opposed to the face of the deep, the face of the earth, the face of man in the first 3 chapters. Cain is sent away. He goes away into exile. The presence of God, man in the ground, and then the creeping beast of the field waiting to pounce. Those are ideas that are reminiscent of the previous chapters that come before this. And then some brand new ideas we haven't seen, and it's super important. I know you're like, get to the text. I will, I promise. But you need to recognize these new ideas. We have not seen any of these ideas I'm about to list. We have not seen so far in the narrative of Scripture. So it's very important. We haven't seen a keeper of sheep. Sexual relations between man and woman. We have not seen the offering of fruit, the offering of fat portions, human anger, sin crouching to attack. We have not seen murder and bloodshed or blood crying from the ground. We have not seen the ground swallowing up blood. We've not seen an image bearer actually being cursed personally. We've not seen anyone being a fugitive and a wanderer, or someone receiving greater punishment than they can handle. We have not seen anyone being hidden from God's face. We're almost done, and you can write all these things down, watch it slower, and take note of it. We've not seen a man seeking revenge, a 7-fold completion, a mark on a person, someone being sent away from God's presence, someone settling in a foreign land, a city being built, someone taking 2 wives for himself, and then musical and bronze instruments. Whew. Those are very important. All those ideas, brand new to the narrative. Very important for us to take note of. We're going to continue in verse 9. If you haven't watched the previous video on verse 1 through 8, you can go watch that. You don't have to. It says, "Then the Lord said to Cain," right after Cain rose up to kill Abel, the Lord comes in and goes, "Hey, where's Abel? You know, your brother." And Cain said, "I do not know." Straight up lied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" So as we continue to unpack how this chapter relates to what comes before it, let's think of ideas that this is reminiscent of. So the second question that God asks Cain here is, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And you go, that's the first one. No. If you go to verse 5 or 6, verse 6, God says, "Hey, why are you angry, buddy?" So this is technically the second question. But Cain actually lies here. This is very different than how Adam responded to God's question in Genesis chapter 3, when God says, "Hey, where are you, Adam?" And Adam is honest. He's straight up about where he is. And when God says, this is a very similar question, where is Abel? Just like God says, where are you, Adam? Very similar question, but Cain responds differently. He lies. Adam did not lie in Genesis 3, though. He was honest, and Cain here is hiding and deceiving. He knows exactly where Abel is. He killed him. And so this story seems to be a digression from Genesis 3. It's just plummeting even more down. Verse 10, and the Lord said, what have you done? If that question sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly what God asked of Eve in Genesis 3. And so now we have both these questions being combined and asked toward Cain. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. The ground. So a couple of things to note about verse 10. This narrative has God asking two questions to Cain, when God only asked this question to Adam and this question to Eve in Genesis 3. So when we go, why does that matter? First of all, we note it. We go, why is this significant? Well, a second question might be, what is this revealing about what's happening compared to what happened in Genesis 3? How do we compare these two stories? What's actually being revealed in this? Also, God asked one of these two questions, I already said that, to both Adam and Eve, but they're both directed at Cain in this story. As if to almost combine Adam and Eve into one here, but it's Cain. Technically, that's what Cain is, the offspring of both of them, so that makes sense. Also, we've seen the voice is a callback to Genesis 1 and 2, and you go, what are you talking about? God's voice echoes through his work of creation. God speaks creation into existence. God speaks order into chaos, and God speaks structure and order out of disorder. He speaks to man. And then in Genesis chapter 3, we have Eve listening to the voice of the serpent. We also have Adam listening to the voice of his wife. And so both, Adam and Eve disobeying God's voice, listening to another voice. And now this time, the voice is referenced, but this voice is the voice of a murdered, righteous man crying out for justice, which Jesus will reference as the blood of righteous Abel down to Zechariah in the Gospels. And now you are cursed, the Lord declares, Cain, cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. He is appropriately accusing Cain of this crime. So the opening of the mouth here, the ground has opened its mouth. This is very important. Then you go figuratively, metaphorically, the ground is opening its mouth. Also, in a kind of literal sense, it is. The ground did indeed soak up and swallow the blood. And you go, well, that's not the blood. The ground actually is like drinking in the blood. In some sense, the ground is absorbing the blood. That's what's important. The opening of mouths here is especially present in the last story. Let's think about Genesis chapter 3, where the fall of man involves opening their mouths to eat what is forbidden. Okay? And now the ground is metaphorically and in some sense literally opening its mouth to receive what is not appropriate, what is not fitting in God's ideal, which is innocent bloodshed. Okay, so the ground here, opening the mouth to receive what is not appropriate, is likened, I would say, it's compared to, we can compare it to Adam and Eve doing the same. Also, a question becomes, isn't the ground already cursed because of Adam? Because you read Genesis 3, God goes, cursed is the ground because of you. And yet here, he says, you are cursed, Cain, from the ground. What does it mean for man to be cursed from the ground? Is this a further, an even further consequence than what Adam received? Is this even worse? Is this going, further into the not ideal? Verse 12. I can't talk, so let's just read the verse, and hopefully more ideas will come to me. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, God says to Cain. So considering the consequences Cain is receiving, the hand of Cain right here, taking Abel's life, just to call back to verse 11, Cain taking Abel's life is what Adam and Eve did with the forbidden fruit. They reached out their hand and they took what was off limits. Both instances, both Cain here and Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, both are raising their hands in defiance to do what ends in death. Also, the fact that the ground lends Cain its strength here, It shall no longer yield to its strength, whereas apparently before this, the ground was yielding its strength to Cain. It means that even when God cursed the ground, and this is why we track things where we're at narratively, where we're at chronologically in the story, because God has cursed the ground, and so we assume, well, that means the ground's no longer going to help the man at all. But apparently, the ground has been yielding its strength to Cain in some degree. So when God cursed the ground in Genesis 3 with Adam, apparently it didn't mean the ground would not lend its strength to man. It just meant that there would be difficulty now, sweat, pain, turmoil, thorns, thistles. Cain said to the Lord, okay, here's Cain answering back, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you've driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. Double whammy, I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. Cain is rightly concerned. As he should be, he's freaking out. This concern and fear of being killed, when we think about the narrative so far, we have not seen that present in any of the stories in any of creation up to this point. Adam and Eve didn't have this fear of their lives being taken or being killed. We don't see them voicing that after God declares their consequences. Also, this sequence of events, it seems to follow the same pattern in Genesis 3. So let's think about what has transpired so far with Cain and Abel. Cain is jealous of what his brother has, the favor and the acceptance of God for his sacrifice and for Abel. Cain becomes jealous and angry. Desire settles in to take Abel's life. He acts on that desire after having a conversation with Abel. He's likened to the serpent in the field, crouching, waiting to pounce on his prey. And then Cain receives consequences, and that's it. That's exactly what we see in Genesis 3. Desire settles in after a conversation Eve has with the serpent. Adam and Eve act on that desire, which is dishonorable to God, in opposition to God, disobedience. God calls them into question. God gives them consequences. You'll see a voice in both narratives. There's a voice here crying out from the ground, and there seems to be a voice of sin crouching at the door trying to get Cain to listen to him versus the same voice we see in Genesis 3. Adam listening to the voice of his wife, Eve listening to the voice of the serpent. So you have all these different components, and almost like in the exact same order, the process of sin takes place, which is what James speaks of. That desire starts within us, it gives birth to sin, and then that gives birth to death. But in this specific situation, even considering how this exact scenario is very similar to Genesis 3, Cain responds differently. Adam and Eve don't even respond to God's consequences that he gives them. But here, Cain does. It's a little different. We almost see this progression in human, maybe even evil is an appropriate word, if not human, I don't know what you'd call it, but Cain seems to go a little further than Adam and Eve even did. Also, verse 14, when it says he'd be a fugitive and a wanderer hidden from God's face, this means, if we think about the narrative so far, this means Cain and Abel were outside of the garden, but they were not yet exiled from the presence of God. Because verse 16 is going to say Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, which means that even after Adam and Eve fell, Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve were not yet exiled from the presence of God. They were not yet hidden from his face and his favor here that Cain is removed from. So there seems to be something going on here that we often fill in the gaps and go, they were cut off from God's presence entirely, no favor at all. That doesn't seem to be what happens. They're cut off from the tree of life, which does involve something, but it's not the total presence and favor of God they're removed from. Also, when Adam and Eve were exiled, they were not hidden from God's face, apparently, because Cain goes, I want to be hidden from your face. This sucks. This is something new. Cain is the first person to experience this, and so I just want to be thinking about how this story is, again, taking the fall narrative even further into depravity and exile and human evil. And then the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. And then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So away from the presence is east of Eden in this land of Nod. This land right here is symbolic of being away from God's presence in the Garden of Eden region. So God placing a mark, well, actually back up to verse 14. Cain is driven away from two specific things. And again, all we're doing is comparing what we're reading now in light of what's come before it. And Adam and Eve were only driven away from the tree of life specifically. God places a mark here on Cain before he exiles him. Now, what does that sound like? What is that reminiscent of? What does that remind you of? In Genesis 3, before God exiles Adam and Eve from the tree of life, he does what? He marks them in a different way by clothing them. He covers them. So that seems to be very similar to what's going on here. And also we have this new land, Nod, which seems to be at odds with and different than Eden. When Adam and Eve were exiled, they remained in the general region of the garden, apparently, rather than being sent off to start over, create a new life in a new place. But here, Cain is farther. Cain is removed even more. And so, just thinking about how Cain is the first person to be sent away from the presence of God. And that tells me that in light of what Adam and Eve did, they were still not sent away from God's presence. Depending on how you qualify and define that. They were only exiled from the tree of life and access to that within the garden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So the next story of human birth, think about the first human that we see born, the first man that's born, is in the beginning of this chapter. Adam and Eve come together, they produce Cain. Cain is conceived as the result of Adam knowing his wife. The second, I guess after Abel, the second woman that is named in the narrative of Scripture, or not even named, that is referred to as giving birth to a man, is this nameless wife of Cain. So, just thinking about how this nameless woman is the second woman, and I'm using the word nameless on purpose, not to diminish her value and significance, but to say the Bible seems to intentionally leave out her name, possibly to make a statement about her bearing a man in contrast with Eve bearing a man. Possibly. The nameless woman here is the second woman in the entire Bible that we have that has a man. No one else before or in between her and Eve. She's the second. So it's interesting that she's nameless. Also, we saw God make the world. If you go to Genesis 1 and 2, God made the world. He planted a garden. He placed man in that garden, in the world. But now, almost like in contrast to that, we see man building his own thing, which seems to be juxtaposed to Eden and God's ideal. This is man building outside of God's sacred territory. This is man building to survive versus Adam being placed by God in Eden graciously. And so you're going to see Nod and Eden seem to almost be competing entities, cities that are symbolic of those who are with God versus those who are opposed to God. And this will pretty much set the tone for the rest of the narrative. You will have those opposed to God and his people and those who are on God's side. And those who are building outside of God's ideal on their own, in their own strength, in opposition to God's ideal being Eden. They're just surviving. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mahuhael, and Mahuhael fathered Methuselah. And Methuselah is one of my favorite names, man, fathered Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives, and you're like, my guy. Not okay. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. Zillah, like Godzilla. Lamech takes 2 wives. Let's think about this. When God brings a wife to Adam in Genesis 2, which is the ideal, he gives him 1 wife, 1 woman to be with. And again, we just see this contrast between the rebellious ways of humanity versus the right ways of God and his ideal. God gives a wife. Lamech here takes 2. God gives 1, man takes 2. I just want you to see that comparison and that contrast. Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. And he was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. Jubilee! I don't know, that's just what comes to mind. He's jubilous. Zillah, Godzilla also bore Tubal-Cain. and he was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. If we can't have fun, why are we here? The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. As my dog barks, I have my own Godzilla. Lamech said to his wives, now this gets interesting, hey, Ada, Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77. Let's think about this. Instead of man listening to the voice of his wife, like in Genesis 3, God says, because you've listened to the voice of your wife, now we see Lamech making his two wives listen to his voice. Lamech here is deciding what is appropriate vengeance. He's deciding it's okay to take life, which is anti-God, which is anti-God's ideal. He's assuming the place of God. God gives life. God decides appropriate vengeance. When he tells Cain, if anyone, takes your life, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. But now man, Lamech specifically, is stepping into the place of God to assume the role of creator and judge. Outside of Eden, you have man living on his own terms, man deciding things on his own terms. But here, in Eden at least, in contrast to what's happening outside of Eden, in Eden, you're supposed to have those listening to God and his ideal, letting God decide, letting God judge, letting God create and give instruction. So I just want you to think about that. We've seen the voice before. This time it's flipped. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Cain killed him. So here, I want you to note the language. God, when Eve has Seth, she goes, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel. Let me take you to what Eve says in the beginning of this chapter when she has Cain. Okay? This is a very different attitude and heart posture. Her attitude has changed. And I don't believe I'm reading into the text either. Adam knew Eve, his wife. She conceived and bore Cain. Now this is wonderful. Some would say, well, up to this point, possibly Adam and Eve have had children, but it's only been girls. And so this is why Cain is listed first as the first man. And she's going, I've gotten a man after all these girls I've been having. And because that's how people make sense of how Cain ends up having a wife. Well, he took from he had an older sister, and that's his wife, and things get odd, and possibly, but I'm not going to plant any ideas definitively on that. But she goes, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. So I just want you to see, she does say God helped, but she says, I've gotten a man. Now, someone read that differently, but when I compare it to what she says about Seth, I do see a different attitude. When she talks about Seth, she goes, God has appointed for me another offspring. She didn't say, I've gotten anything, I've produced me, I've gotten a man. God help me. This is, God has appointed for me. These are two, once again, very different attitudes that I see in Eve after this whole thing has transpired. It once again presents God's ideal versus man's way outside of Eden, which seems to be the capstones of this chapter. The chapter starts with Eve having a child, a man. The chapter ends with Eve having another man. But there's a difference in attitude and how she thinks about that, how she talks about that. And if you think I'm reading into the text, let me know in the comments. Share your thoughts. I'd love to talk about this. To Seth also a son was born. And he, that being Seth, called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So when I think about how, up to this point, God has named things in Genesis 1 and 2. Adam has named animals. Adam named his wife, not just Eve in Genesis 3, but woman in Genesis 2. So I just wonder, is it significant that here Eve, she bore a son and called his name Seth? Is it significant that she names Seth here, and then Seth names his son Enosh here? Whereas up to this point, it's just God and Adam naming, and then Eve ends up naming. You go, why does this matter? Because it might speak to just almost the up and down human experience of of people learning how to work with God, learning how to surrender and humble themselves and not assume roles and positions they're not supposed to. Not saying Eve did that, but that seems to be the rest of the narrative. You'll see that throughout Israel's history and anyone God chooses to partner with. So enough of me jibber-jabbering. The next session will be on literary context, but instead of looking backward, we're going to look within the chapter. And we're going to see how the chapter cross-references itself. We talk about cross-referencing, so we're going to do a little cross-referencing within just the chapter, and then we'll have a session on literary context looking forward. Where else in the biblical narrative do we see certain ideas and keywords repeated, or motifs on repeat throughout the story? And then we'll look at allusions to Jesus, and we'll close this chapter out. All right? That's all I got for you guys today. I'll see you guys in the next episode on Genesis chapter 4. Well, so when we draw out wisdom from narrative, in particular, we're looking at narrative. We have to learn how to distinguish between what's prescribed and what is described. Okay, most of narrative in the Bible is describing what happened. So we need to learn when something is happening, how to glean wisdom from both good and bad examples that are set by people. Okay, so let's just jump to, let's start in verse 1. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord, So I've written some ideas down. I want to make sure I say them right, so I hope you guys will take notes and really take this to heart. It is a good idea to do what Eve is doing here. She says, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Okay, it's a good idea in whatever we are doing to recognize that I'm only able to do this with the divine help and enablement of God. It's okay for us to admit, and it's good to admit, that we actually had a part to play in what God accomplishes through us, but we must never reduce God down to nothing more than a helper to aid me in my endeavors and ambitions and dreams. God is not a part of our world and our life and our ambitions and our dreams. We're a part of his kingdom. And so Eve here, she gets one part right, which is that she's gotten a man with the help of God. And it's only possible because God aided her and allowing her to produce Cain. But the whole I've gotten a man, if you contrast that with the end of the chapter, when Eve has Seth, it seems to have a different tune. Okay, verse 2, and again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a worker of the ground. So what we see here is a difference in occupation. Abel and Cain both have their respective roles in the world, in the family, in the order of things. There's diversity in occupation. When it comes to us following God, you will see the same diversity in career, in calling, in gifting, in experience, in roles. And it's really important for us to recognize, not just to accept and tolerate, but to actually enjoy and recognize whatever God has made us to do, whatever he's gifted us to be. And so part of living satisfied lives in Christ involves us accepting and owning our role and our God-given gifts and the part God wants us to play in his kingdom. It's incredibly important, not just to tolerate it, not just to accept it, I wish I could change it, but to actually go, wow, I truly enjoy the fact that God has allowed me in any capacity to be a part of what he's doing in the world. So we see Abel and Cain both have their respective roles. There's going to be a bit of jealousy that creeps into Cain as God accepts Abel's offering and doesn't regard his. Okay, so be on the lookout for that. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Okay, so Cain here, leading the charge seemingly, is the first to bring an offering of the fruit of the ground, which we know is cursed, God cursed, and he's bringing that to God. Okay, and I say that on purpose. It's important for us to recognize that. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions, and the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. Okay, so what we see here is that God intentionally seems to regard Abel's offering, not to make a statement about how God hates Cain. Forget you, buddy, but actually to give Cain his own, I want you to think about this, Cain is about to be presented with his own test and his own opportunity to choose life over death and sin, which is the very same choice we see God give Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3. The forbidden fruit in the knowledge of good and evil, that tree represents the free will choice of humanity. Cain is about to now have his own metaphorical tree of knowledge, his own opportunity. which in this case, the test would be, again, Cain, will you give in to jealousy? Will you give in to anger and murder your brother? Or will you choose to rule that sinful desire? Okay. God's favor on Abel actually presents a test to Cain. And this happens in our lives when we understand how this is just this story is on repeat throughout human history, through us, through other people's lives. We see that the favor of God will be on people's lives. And when we recognize that, there's a tendency, our human default is to grow jealous, is to grow comparative, is to become angry and bitter. But when we see the favor of God on the lives of others, here's the test that we're presented with. Will we celebrate the loving kindness of God that he's extended to others? Or will we grow jealous? Will we harbor bitterness? Will we allow ourselves to grow resentful and hateful and end up belittling the grace of God in our own lives and diminish the image of God in other people? That's the test that we are constantly facing, the test that is constantly presented to us in different shapes and variations, okay? So when you read verse 3 through 5, Cain, bringing his offering, and God goes, I have no regard for that. Cain is very angry and his face falling. In this case, it's to show downcast despair, bitterness kind of thing. Both Cain and Abel, when we think about this, both Cain and Abel brought what they had to give. Okay, so God not regarding Cain was an opportunity for Cain to reflect on the situation, to examine himself, to examine his heart, to examine what he's bringing, and to try again. So when we talk about following God and serving and bringing offerings to God, however we qualify that, following God and doing what we believe is good might not always work out the first time. It might not always go the way we anticipated. It might not always work out the way that we expected it to. It might not work out at all according to our own initial expectations. Sometimes offering true service to God will very simply look like trying again, and not sitting in bitterness or jealousy or frustration or complacency or laziness, but getting up. Not sitting in cynical doubt, but getting up and trying again. Also, I want us to be meditating on this. When it comes to the role that Israel will play in the world as a nation throughout human history, they have a priestly role to the surrounding nations. Even within the nation of Israel, God has set aside one tribe to function as to do that priestly service within the nation. Okay, so there's always this distinction. Some people can approach God. It's never on their terms. It's never according to their own ways. It's on God's terms. It's who he's prescribed, the way he's prescribed. So thinking of that, there might be, I'm not saying there absolutely is, but there might be an element of Cain here is assuming a role that God didn't call him to play. Now, later in the book of Hebrews, we'll see that Cain didn't bring his offering in faith. Abel did bring an offering in faith that was more acceptable. It was a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. So it doesn't necessarily say that Cain, in and of itself, that offering was condemned. The letter of Hebrews, nor anywhere else in Scripture, does it condemn Cain for bringing an offering, but he didn't bring it in faith, which is different than Abel. Okay, so potentially there might be an issue of Cain approaching God on his terms rather than God on God's terms, and bringing something on God's terms. Cain might be bringing something God didn't instruct him to, or God didn't even desire for him to. Cain might be playing the role of priest that Abel is apparently allowed and approved of playing. Cain might be trying to play that role that God never actually assigned Cain to play, which, was to bring offerings like Abel. The story that comes to mind for me would be King Saul. When he's freaking out, he's waiting for Samuel. The pressure's building around him. The war's getting worse. His army is, scattering. He's freaking out, and he ends up offering a sacrifice to God, which Samuel says, that was not okay. That was not your role to play. That was not what God prescribed. That was not what I instructed you to do. And I think in some sense, Cain potentially might be playing a role that God only assigned to Abel. Maybe Abel was to be the one functioning in the role of priest, while Cain was to offer service to God in different ways, which we're going to see at least involves Cain resisting the sinful desire to kill Abel. So that resisting the murderous rage on the part of Cain, that would have been the sacrifice God was truly looking for from Cain. So again, Cain might be trying to assume the duty of priestly service that God didn't necessarily instruct Cain to engage in. And I know some would go, well, Abel's not engaging in priestly service. Well, when you offer God anything in any capacity, it is as if to be functioning in that priestly kind of way, in offering spiritual service to God. So I just think we can't be sure that God ever wanted Cain to bring a sacrifice at all. But we know Abel was regarded with favor and acceptance, and I'm going somewhere with this, because Abel came in faith, which presumably Cain does not come in faith, which means he's approaching God through some other means and on the basis of something else other than faith. And I just want to be thinking about, even if that is not true to the text, just considering what Saul does, he assumes a role, he plays a position, he does something that is outside of his instructed God-given role. We can often do the same thing, where we operate outside of the grace and the favor of God and what he's actually called us to, which is no longer operating in faith when it's contrary to God's ideal for you. So no matter what, Cain is not operating in faith here. So we just want to be thinking about, am I, whatever I'm offering to God, whatever I'm doing in the name of God and for his kingdom, is it prompted and motivated by true, genuine, loving faith? Also, verse 5, God didn't have regard for Cain and his offering, obviously. But anger was not the only way Cain could have responded. Cain's initial default response, his human reaction, is to grow angry, and his face fell. Things didn't work out initially for Cain the way they did for Abel. But this doesn't mean that anger was his only option. How we respond to unexpected situations and apparent failure, that is often so important to our faith walk. So anger wants to point the blame. When we grow angry and resentful, anger wants to point the blame and aggression at another person, rather than leading us to be introspective and consider how we can do better and we can grow. We'd rather blame others for us not being able to succeed. Well, I couldn't succeed because of them. And then that bitterness, that anger starts to grow and leaves us complacent and lazy and not moving, inactive. So we want to be careful that our response to initial failure or apparent failure or things not working out, that our initial response is not this settling into an anger that's directed towards a person who seems to have God's favor when we don't seem to have that. God doesn't seem to be working out for me. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen?" What I want you to see is that God actually interrupts Cain's pity party, and God meets him in the midst of his anger and rage. And God does so in an attempt to keep Cain from acting on his jealousy and rage. So we have to learn how to recognize when God is intervening in those moments where we're just sitting in self-hatred or loneliness or frustration or bitterness or depression or whatever, hopelessness, despair, whatever it is, to recognize when and how God is intervening and trying to meet with us. We have to learn how to be sensitive to the voice and the leading of God, even in our lowest points. Even in our lowest points of brokenness and weakness and deficiency, there is always a way out. Though it might take longer than we initially suspect and wanted it to, God presents us a way out, and him speaking and intervening into our situation is the best thing to recognize. Verse 7 says, "If you do well, will you not be accepted?" God is essentially offering Cain a second chance. And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Someone pointed out, Nancy in the comments, she pointed out that for Cain to not do well does not equal Cain sinning. Okay, so this seems to be a step before actually committing sin. So whatever precedes sin for Cain would be choosing not to do well. And I just want to be thinking of that there are stepping stones to sin in our life. We can choose not to do well, and it's not inherently evil or sinful or bad, but it leads to what ends up being sin. And he goes, look, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So God gives Cain a second chance to do something that would actually lead Cain to being accepted, just like Abel was. But this wouldn't be in the form of Cain bringing another fruit offering. Rather, the way that Cain would do well, the second chance God was offering to Cain, was this opportunity to actually obey, have self-control, and offer that sacrifice unto God, rather than giving into anger and murdering Abel. So Cain resisting that sinful urge would have been an offering that he would be bringing to God. Also, the sacrifices God is truly looking for, we know, the main sacrifice God desires, compassion, mercy. He's concerned with how we treat people. Even in the midst of our own deficiency and frustration and bitterness, how do you treat people in your lowest moments, in your deepest moments of brokenness and hurt? God cares about how we value the image of God in others, even when things are not going well for us. Even when things are not going well for us. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him, in case you forgot who his brother was. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Hey, where's Abel? Your brother." The text really likes to repeat this key idea that Abel was Cain's brother. He said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And you're supposed to think, well, Cain, you're not exactly stepping up as the older brother in this situation. You kind of should be functioning as your brother's keeper. So let me back it up. God informs Cain that he needs to rule over sin in verse 8. Right? He reminds Cain of what sin wants to do. Right? God says, sin's crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you. It wants to overtake you. And that's a good thing for God to remind Cain about in the middle of heated temptation, in the middle of the battle with sin. The real objective of sin is that it wants to overtake and conquer and lead you into what dishonors God and break you down. And what God says we can do by his grace, which is we can conquer, we can fight back, that's what God wants to remind us of in the midst of temptation. Rather than looking at sin as our only option, God wants us to remember that in the middle of temptation, there is another option. And I know mentally, like we understand that information, like we agree with that as factual, but when it comes down to it, it's hard to really believe in our heart of hearts that we truly have another option, because sin at times feels like it's our only option. So God presents us with another option the same way he does for Cain. He warns people of the danger and threat of sin, and it's our job to do what Cain did not do, which is to heed the voice of God and to consider what God is saying. Also, according to verse 8, Cain rising up and killing his brother, Cain chose to remain silent towards God. And you go, what do you mean? Well, when God was speaking to Cain, Cain said nothing. And then the next verse is Cain spoke to Abel. And I really want us to hone in for a minute. Instead of having a conversation with God, Cain is silent to God and he has a conversation with Abel. And that conversation seems to be a reflection and of his anger and a way of pointing his aggression and anger towards Abel in the field. And so the conversation with Abel is the choice for Cain to tiptoe closer to sin. It was literally a stepping stone towards sin, giving into the sinful desire within him to have that conversation, which seems to be the way that Cain lures Abel into the field. So Cain here, instead of getting farther from temptation, he seems to be tiptoeing closer to it by doing what would actually encourage that to happen, rather than running from sin, rather than venting his frustration to God personally. So when sin comes, we have to be mindful about the conversation we choose to have. Who do we choose to talk to? What is the conversation we're entertaining? And what do we do with that initial desire and temptation? There is an initial desire and temptation, a thought, whatever it is that you have, that desire, you can do something with that rather than letting it take you for a joyride. You can stop it in its tracks. You can truly, genuinely bring that before God in prayer first, which is the best course of action. Because the enemy really wants us to try and resolve sin in our own way, some other way without God, which inevitably brings us deeper into the temptation, then moves us one step closer to sinning. And so here's what I encourage you to do. Don't let sin draw you in closer. Don't take the bait. Recognize that anything we do apart from the Spirit of God leading us is inevitably going to bring us closer to what would promote sin. And so the conversation with Abel seems to be a stepping stone for Cain towards actually murdering him. And then Cain ends up what? Killing his brother. So Cain murders his brother as a result of this conversation. What precedes this action? A conversation. What preceded the action of Eve and Adam to eat the forbidden fruit? It was a conversation with the serpent. So we don't know if Cain would have murdered Abel if he had just gone to God and voiced his frustration to him instead of remaining silent. Murder started in the heart of Cain. It worked its way seemingly into a discussion that moved the hand of Cain to strike Abel. And so the process of sin has more steps than we'd like to admit, which is why Jesus will say that our sins or our lips and our words are often a reflection of our very heart. So we don't know what Cain said. We know that luring Abel into the field to have a conversation, or the conversation was the way to lure him into the field, that was the expression of Cain's murderous heart. Cain wanting to end his life, Cain being jealous, all of that stuff. And then verse 9, the Lord asks, where's Abel? And Cain goes, by my brother's keeper. Well, Cain decided not only to lie to God directly, but to deny his role as the keeper in his brother's life. And so there might be a play on words where Cain is pointing to the fact that, well, Abel's the one who keeps sheep, not me. But Cain here, no matter what, he's denying his role, his God-given role, as a preserver of life or a keeper of his brother, which is what he should have been rather than a taker of life, a sustainer, a preserver of life. You and I, we have to admit this, in some capacity, we have been given a God-given role as a preserver of life in the lives of others, and to deny that role will keep us one step removed from God's best for us, and might even make us more susceptible to aggressive tendencies and sinful behavior that actually belittles the image of God in others. So we are called to, as human image bearers of God, we're called to protect, to love, to care for all the other image bearers of God in the world, and to live with the mentality that God has given us some way to play this role of watchman or keeper in the lives of those closest to us. And so we should live as keepers of others and concern ourselves with others and their well-being, rather than living isolated as little islands that care nothing about others. So learn from the mistakes of Cain, learn from what he did wrong. There's wisdom to glean from this. The next session will be continuing in Genesis 4. We'll start in verse 10. We'll continue applying the wisdom of Genesis 4 to our lives. And I'll see you guys in that session. So Cain was still able to build an entire city outside the presence of God, but it wasn't success in God's eyes. And every single day we're choosing to build something outside the Eden ideal, or we're building things according to the leading of the Spirit. I just wonder if we're building Eden, the kingdom of God, or if we're building up Nod, the kingdom of rebellious man. So let's talk about this and jump into Genesis chapter 4. Verse 10, right after Cain says, hey, what am I, my brother's keeper? And God goes, oh, let's find out. Verse 10, the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Crying to me from the ground. So just to think about who God has revealed himself to be in this passage. God hears and regards the voice of the martyr. God hears and regards the voice of the oppressed, the murdered, the abused, the forgotten, the one being unjustly treated. And if this is the heart of God, this is where we bridge the gap between who God is and what we're supposed to do. The character of God revealed in Scripture should move us to live differently. So the best point of application is to look at who God is and to make the appropriate adjustments. If this is the heart of God, then we need to be people like we need to rise to the calling and be people that especially pay attention to the voice of those being unjustly treated, those who are victims of oppression and abuse, those who are forgotten, widows and orphans, sojourners, strangers, that kind of thing. And the Lord says, now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. Verse 11 says, God holds Cain personally responsible for the sin he committed. God doesn't let him off easy, and God doesn't minimize Cain's murder. We serve a God who holds people accountable and gives just consequences to the guilty party. Cain chose to use his hands for evil. Okay, that there's no way to make that any less than what it is. Cain chose to use what 1 Corinthians and Romans talks about, the members of his body. He chose to use that for evil. And every day we have to understand we are faced with the choice of whether or not we're going to use what God has given us to do harm or to bring life. The words of my mouth, the hands God has given me, the resources God has put in my hand, the time, the abilities, the gifts, the opportunities, the relationships, the stuff, everything God has placed into my care and my responsibility. I either have the ability to use that for harm or to use that to bring life. Cain here chose to take life rather than give life. And the Lord continues, when you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. you shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. So when we think about how God created the ground to lend humanity its strength, in the beginning, God makes Adam, from the ground outside of Eden, then places him in the garden to cultivate the ground, to work the ground. Work was always intended to be good. From the beginning, God's intention was for humanity to work in partnership with God. And part of the way humanity did that was by utilizing what God had made available within creation. And so creation and the natural world was part of the process of how humans were to partner with God, which is really cool. God gave us everything we need to do what he called us to. And now Cain here is going to wander around as a fugitive. Rather than receiving the strength and the assistance from the ground that God had placed him on to work, the inevitable experience for Cain and for those who live outside of relationship with God is that they are a fugitive and they wander on the earth with no sense of strength being lent to them from God. Now, of course, there is the general grace of God, which is that, God allows the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. There's that general grace and mercy of God. But there seems to be something unique about how Jesus, I'm just thinking about scripture here, when Jesus tells his disciples, Peter goes, we left everything. What do we get? And then he goes, there isn't anyone who's left anything for me that won't receive 100-fold. In other words, or 10-fold, whatever it ends up being. So the inevitable experience for those who live outside of relationship with God is that they're destined to do things in their own limited strength and ability. What God made available, what God makes available to them for their benefit, people who are outside of relationship with God, what God makes available to humanity for our benefit, people don't have access to apart from relationship with God. Now, there are some general things where it's like, I don't know, unbelievers seem to be pretty creative and have a lot of stuff even without God being in the picture and not having a relationship with him, rather. God seems to allow unbelievers to do a lot. But think about what God would make available to people should they be in relationship with him. Those things in particular, they now don't have access to, just like Cain doesn't. So it's not just that the ground does not yield its strength. It's specifically because of Cain's proximity to God now that the ground doesn't yield its strength. These two ideas are connected. It's not just, hey, the ground doesn't yield strength to you. It sucks to suck. But it's because of the fact that Cain is now in farther proximity to God. He's further from the presence of God. So, apart from relationship with God, there are certain things that we won't be able to experience or attain in our own strength and ability until God brings us into relationship with him through faith. And it's like a world opens up. Resources become available. So people who are outside of the Garden of Eden ideal, they don't have relationship with God. They're destined to, until they trust in Jesus for salvation, they're living within the boundaries of their own human limitations and ability, and it ends up looking like scarcity. But living within the boundaries of friendship with God is to have everything we need at our disposal, everything God wants to gift us with for our use and our benefit as we partner with him in the world. There's so much that God makes available that we see just in this Cain story. And there are certain things that, humanity just doesn't have access to outside of relationship with God. Doesn't mean they have access to nothing, but there are certain things that they could, with all their human might, try and attain, and they never will, because it's God who grants that. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you've driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I'm going to be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me, which is what the Lord just said. So Cain voices his concerns to God about his punishment. How this is too much for me to bear, Lord. And that was what Cain initially should have done with his anger and his desire to kill Abel. He should have brought it to God and voiced his genuine frustration and concern. Here we actually see Cain do the right thing. Not in complaining. Some might read this as complaining and thinking God is unfair. I don't read it like that. But rather, Cain seems to be seeking for a little help from God to carry what is too heavy for Cain by himself. And God does aid and assist Cain by giving him a mark. We're going to see that in a minute. So we serve a God that lends help and assistance out of his grace and mercy. Not because we inherently deserve these things, but it's on us to voice our concerns and our frustrations to God in order to bring him into what we're dealing with. And sometimes that becomes the very access point for the resources and the help of God. It's through us crying out for help. There are certain things that just don't happen. Not everything, but certain things that don't happen in our life, our world, our communities, our government, without the people of God asking for God to move. So again, not to make that a general statement about everything God intends to do, but some things, prayers to be the causal element of that. Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And you'd think Cain would be like, "Let's go. That's nice. Thank you." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Now, this is really interesting. God helps Cain. Cain is essentially kind of poking at God for a little help here. And God helps Cain in an unexpected and unique kind of way by marking Cain. So we have to understand that the way God answers our cries of distress, our concerns, our frustrations, it's not always the way that we expect or even what we believe is ideal in that situation. What we think is best, God doesn't always work according to that. God answers our cries of distress in a myriad of ways and doesn't aid people in one restricted universal way. God has countless methods for assisting people that are relative to the person and the situation. Okay, so Cain didn't know to ask for a mark. Okay, there's nothing about that in the language Cain uses. But God still gave Cain what Cain didn't even know to ask for. And that just shows the grace and the kindness of God, even towards this murderous man that deserves none of this. But this is the mercy of God. To not just hear the cry of the oppressed and the martyr and give justice, but to even give the general grace that he has available to those who would live in opposition to him, which is what we see Jesus say. The rain falls on both the just and the unjust. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So I want us to be thinking about this. Cain is removed from the presence of God in Eden. He goes to a city east of Eden, and the east represents distance from God and the Eden ideal. And so outside of God's presence, man is forced to wander and try to make a life for themselves. But as a wandering nomad, it never achieves the original Eden ideal God has for humanity. And so man in his own strength outside of God's presence is destined to wander and produce according to his own limited ability and resources, however temporarily impressive those achievements may be. So I want us to be thinking about where in our own life we might be operating outside of God's best and his ideal for us. In what categories of our life fit this description of being outside of God's will and his best for us. You're going to see in verse 17 that Cain builds a city. So you think my guy had it pretty good. Not really. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. That'd be something else. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. And then you'll see the list of his children who have children who have children. Cain built a city. Okay. Humanity can be, I want us to be thinking about this. Humanity can be innovative and creative and even successful from a worldly perspective, even outside of God's presence and ideal. So you don't have to be in relationship with God to have worldly success. Because Cain here builds a city. Cain here has descendants. Cain here has a lineage. God made man, humanity, to innovate, to cultivate, to create, to have dominion. So naturally, humanity will try and fill this God-given desire and express this God-given calling on their own terms and in their own way. If God has designed humanity to do this, humanity will find a way to do this even outside of God's presence. But without God's leading, without his spirit, without the presence of God, humanity will always seek to express these deep God-given tendencies in ways that aren't conducive for life, in ways that aren't good for human flourishing. So the question becomes, what else was Cain supposed to do? Not build a city? Not have children? He's doing what he can with what he has. And that's all man can do outside of God and his divine presence is survive. You might be able to see some temporary success and have some temporary achievements outside of God's presence and relationship with him and his will being done. Whatever we build, it doesn't amount to anything eternally. So we have to make sure whatever you're building, whatever you're doing, whatever you're saying is in service to God, it's it's my job to ensure that we cover those things in prayer and that the presence of God is the motivating force behind all that we do. We have to make sure that whatever we're doing in our life, not just for God directly, but in our life should be worship. We have to be sure that whatever we do is the result of God leading us, not the result of us being selfishly ambitious or innovating outside of his will. You're going to see Cain has children, they have children, then we get to Lamech. Lamech has 2 wives. In fact, he took 2 wives. And I think this language is very intentional to note the kind of kids Cain has. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other one was Godzilla. That's just how I call her. So verse 19, Lamech takes more than is beneficial. So we think, what do you mean? Well, more is not always better. God gave Adam 1 wife in the ideal, Genesis 2. Now Lamech here, outside of Eden, and seemingly in opposition to God's ideal, he takes 2. So God gives 1. Man, rebellious, ambitious man, takes 2. The ambition within man is to always desire for more and to take what God has given further than what God desires, or where further than God desires for it to go. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's never enough for so many people. Even our human default is to never be content with what God says is enough. Like, that's sufficient, that's good. Our human tendency is to go, no, I want more. And there should be a healthy dose of not being complacent, but there should be contentment paired with this healthy, godly ambition for the things of God. So rebellious humanity wants to corrupt the good things God has created and given us. Rebellious humanity wants to twist what God has given into something that goes further than God intended. And so more, we have to understand as we navigate life, more without God's blessing doesn't necessarily mean good. Actually, more can cause more problems. Lamech isn't explicitly condemned for having 2 wives, but this doesn't mean it's ideal either. This is why I say when we read narrative, pay attention to what's prescribed as command and instruction versus what's simply being described. Some would say, well, God says nothing bad about this. That doesn't make it good. Well, God says nothing good about it and doesn't make it bad. Well, I think when you see who this is attached to, it gives us more clarity on what's really happening. Okay, the decision to take 2 wives is done by a murderous man that seems to be more wicked than Cain. So I don't think we're supposed to view this as good or the ideal. When we take more than what God says is good for us, it never ends well. Never ends well. So Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of those who play the lyre and pipe. Godzilla also bore Tubal-Cain, and he was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah, and I've done videos on these little. You probably have more questions than answers. We've done sessions on that. This is just the application phase of this chapter. So thinking about Cain having descendants, we're like, it seems pretty fruitful, seems pretty successful. My guy built the first city. God still allows the descendants of wicked Cain to produce, to innovate, to create new technology, to be successful. Even though it isn't explicitly blessed or condemned by God, it is allowed. Okay, so we need to understand as we look at other people who are outside of God's presence and doing things, man can do these things without the divine guidance of God. But we must be careful not to grow prideful or arrogant about what God has allowed for us to achieve and produce. So I'm not just talking about unbelievers, but as believers, when God does things through us, we have to be careful. Yes, we can, own the part we played and say, praise God that I was able to and God helped me. But to grow prideful and take all credit and to grow arrogant and get an ego, that's wrong when we produce and achieve. Verse 23, Lamech says to his wives, Ada, and yes, Godzilla. He says, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. You know, if Godzilla's actually in heaven, she's going to have she has some words for me, I'm sure. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. As we wind this thing down, and as we think about the wisdom found within this for our own lives, rebellious, wicked man, in opposition to God, will seek revenge on his own terms. This is what Lamech does. Lamech sits in the place of God as judge and as creator. Lamech assumes he has the authority to take life as he pleases, according to how he sees fit. Lamech writes his own rules and decides what vengeance is appropriate, rather than trusting God and living according to God's will and instruction and living according to God's commandments and letting God decide what's best. He doesn't look to God as judge. Lamech takes life, whereas God gives life. When people wrong us, here's the application. Lamech is wronged, so he wrongs the person 77-fold. However he calculated that. When people wrong us, we have to be careful not to allow that offense to produce sin within us that would lead us to do harm to others. We want to be people that preserve and sustain life. We want to bring life, even to those who offend us and cause harm to us. And I know that's a hard pill for us to swallow, but God's people are to be life-giving, not life-taking. We are to trust God will handle things, look to him for perfect justice and judgment. Rather than taking these things into our own hands, we have to remember, vengeance, the Lord says, he says, vengeance is mine. Now Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. You might hear a little bit of resentment within Eve towards Cain for taking Abel's life. You can read into that. You can imagine how a mom would feel. So God restores to Adam and Eve what they had lost, kind of like Job at the end of the story. It's God who restores what is lost, rather than Eve restoring it herself. So Eve understands that she had a role to play in getting a son, but ultimately, she says God has appointed. God appoints for her to produce another son. He allows that to take place. So as we work and labor for God, we have to remember that anything we produce, anything we achieve, has been appointed graciously by God, has been given to us by God, and God makes our efforts produce anything of eternal value. Verse 26, to Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh, and at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So when I read this, it seems as though narratively the scripture is telling us that Enosh might have influenced a generation to begin calling upon the name of the Lord, that he might have had a role to play in that. Now, we can be people that encourage and motivate others to call upon God. Even if Enosh didn't directly influence what was happening in his lifetime, we know, according to Scripture, that God can use our small lives to move others in big ways, to love him and call upon his name, because other people are to see the goodness of God in our own life. Instead of being people that take life and take vengeance, we're called to be people, in contrast to Cain and his descendants. We're called to be people that seek for good and call upon the name of God in all that we do in dedication to him as we preserve life and promote human flourishing. That will end this session on application within Genesis chapter 4. We will continue in Genesis 4 looking at the literary context, or rather cross-referencing Genesis 4 with the rest of Scripture, and then we will finally end with allusions to Jesus. So that's all I got for you guys today. I'll see you guys in the next video. We're going to see that this moment right here is linked to the Jacob and Esau story, as well as the parable of the prodigal son. This moment and detail specifically links us to the flood narrative, as well as when Israel is enslaved in Egypt by Pharaoh. And finally, what God says right here links us to when Jesus says, hey, when you forgive others, forgive them 70 times 7 times. Let's jump into Genesis 4, and I'll show you how all these things are connected. Now, Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've gotten a man, with the help of the Lord. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Okay, now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a worker of the ground. So you have Cain and Abel, different occupations, different kind of fellows. One's the firstborn and one's the younger. What you're going to see in the rest of the Bible is this is what becomes the older brother motif. And it goes something like this. The firstborn son, and yes, I'm reading from my notes so I don't ruin this. The firstborn son is in competition with the younger brother who has the favor. The younger son or brother is chosen by God and receives God's acceptance and favor, while the older brother ends up being jealous of and wanting what it is the younger brother has. And so the older brother motif will be found in stories like, think about Jacob and Esau. Think about Joseph and his 11 brothers. Think about David and his 7 brothers, or the parable of the prodigal son, when the prodigal son, the younger brother, comes home, and who is jealous of the younger brother. Ultimately, we'll see this culminate in Jesus with the rebellious religious leaders of his day who grow jealous, and Jesus there being the favored, anointed, chosen one of God. Okay. Also, this favored son, you're going to see, and you're going, why are you importing all this data? Because we're going to see that Cain brings an offering to God, he's not regarded, while Abel, the younger brother, brings his offering and he's accepted and favored. And actually, Hebrews will say this, he's declared righteous in that. So this favored son who happens to be a shepherd, if you're going to see Abel was a keeper of sheep, that's also going to be found throughout Scripture. Joseph, the chosen favored son of his father Israel, he's going to be a shepherd. Same with David, the one who's chosen, anointed to be the next king. Moses will be the anointed one to lead the people out of Egypt. He'll be the younger brother and a shepherd. Same with Jesus. He is the ultimate shepherd, the good shepherd that Psalm 23 points us to and John 10 is all about. So even consider the shepherds in Luke's gospel who receive the good news of Jesus. It just gives us a glimpse into who it is that God chooses to work with, and it isn't exactly who the world would choose or who the world would see as a good fit, yet God seems to be countercultural in that sense. Not to say that God has something against older brothers and chronologically firstborn children, but to say that God's order of things seems to go against the grains of culture and what we assume to be ideal from a worldly perspective at times. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering, this is the bummer, he had no regard. And so Cain was very angry and his face fell. So when we read the Bible and we're trying to consider what we're reading in light of the rest of Scripture and how might this foreshadow or give us a glimpse into what's going to happen later in the Scriptures, we want to be mindful of especially key repeating ideas within that specific chapter. That will often give us an indication of how other passages might be cross-referenced to what's happening here. There are other ways people cross-reference, but this is just how I like to study and read narrative. Okay, so eventually, what we're going to see, let me pause here, just specifically looking at verse 3, how Cain brings an offering, Abel brings an offering. Eventually, God will tell the people of Israel to bring him their offering of first fruits when they enter into the land. Okay, the offering of fruit will become normal. It will become expected when God's people bring him a part of what came from the ground that they occupy, that God gave them. Okay, so this idea of producing fruit right here, when Cain here brings an offering of the fruit of the ground, that it's not, some people want to speculate that Cain is rejected because of the fact that he's bringing tainted fruit from a corrupted, cursed ground. Remember Genesis 3, God curses the ground, so Cain is bringing corrupted, tainted fruit that God don't want. He don't want no fruit. He wants the fat. He wants the firstborn and the best of the sheep, that kind of thing. And while I think that might be potentially just symbolically representing Cain and his heart posture and what he's bringing, I don't believe that's like the core of what's happening, because God wants fruit. God desires, he's going to ask the people to bring an offering of the first fruits. The idea of producing fruit as an offering to God, that's going to be seen in John 15. By this your Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit. Or in Jeremiah, he talks about the fruitful tree planted by streams of living water. And in every season it's bearing fruit. Same with the Psalms, Psalm chapter 1. And obviously God desires fruit from his people. Matthew chapter 7, the good tree produces good fruit, the bad tree produces bad fruit, the fruit of lips and praise. God desires fruit. So we shouldn't, from this narrative, go, God clearly hates fruit, because God actually made fruit to be good. Even though it comes from a cursed ground, I don't know if we can leap to the conclusion that that's exactly why Cain was rejected, because Cain was specifically rejected with his offering, not necessarily because of his offering. The way he brought it, maybe the heart posture he had in bringing it, that might be a part of it. That might actually be the main thing going on. But I digress. Verse 4, Abel brings the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. The offering of the best of the flock, with the fat dedicated to God specifically, that will be a command within Israel's Levitical sacrificial system, with the tabernacle and the priesthood. And so the fat was to be set apart to God, for God, as holy and as consecrated as his sacred portion. And so we're going to see that later on in Israel's once Israel's formed as a nation, when they come out of Egypt. Verse 5, Cain doesn't get regarded the way Abel is. And so once again, we're going to see Cain is angry, Cain mad, and his face fell. And God goes, why are you angry, bro? Which is exactly the last thing we want to hear when we're mad. But what we're going to see here is the idea of the angry older brother, Cain, who is jealous of his brother's favor and acceptance in the father's sight. We're going to see that all throughout, at different points throughout the biblical narrative. So David's brothers, again, to bring to mind what I already said in verse 1, David's brothers will be jealous of him being anointed as king. Joseph's brothers will be jealous of the rainbow coat Joseph receives and the dreams he receives. Miriam and Aaron will actually complain about their younger brother Moses in Deuteronomy or Numbers chapter 12. And eventually the rebellious religious leaders will grow jealous of Jesus, as represented in the parable of the prodigal son, where the older brother is jealous of the father throwing a party for the younger brother. I've been here forever. I haven't done anything bad. You never throw me a party. And the father goes, my guy, anytime you wanted, you could have had a party. Instead of throwing a pity party, ooh, got him. Verse 6, the Lord said, why are you angry? Again, what you're going to see when God says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? Okay? And if you don't do well, sin is crouching at the door. And here's what sin desires. Its desires contrary to you. It's in opposition to you. It's not for your good, but you gotta rule over it. The beastly nature of sin, preying upon humanity, that will be repeating throughout the scriptures as well, when each consecutive story has a person or a group of people that allow sin to take over them, overtake them, and use these people as a vessel to bring death and destruction into the world, just like we see Cain do here. Okay, so we're going to see that actually happens with Cain. He's going to give in to the sinful desires. Cain speaks to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So the older brother here, harming the younger brother, specifically in a field, is something that we're going to see in the Joseph story, and even with Esau. So remember when Joseph has the dreams, and he goes, hi, brothers, you guys are going to bow down to me. And they're like, not happening. No way. And then he has another dream. Dad, you too. His dad's like, I don't like this, but I'll meditate on it. Eventually, they lure him into the field, and they throw him into a pit, and they sell him into slavery. The idea of the older brothers harming the younger favored brother in the field is also something we'll see with Jacob and Esau. Right after Jacob takes the blessing of Esau and the firstborn, Jacob leaves the house. Esau comes in from the field after hunting game, and Esau wants to kill his brother. So just pay attention to that. There's probably other stories I'm not considering. When they're in the field, Cain rose up. Then the Lord said to Cain, where's Abel, your brother? And Cain goes, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what? What have you done? What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. So pay attention to this. The blood of the innocent martyr, the righteous man, crying from the ground. That will only not only be referenced when Jesus speaks of righteous Abel down to the blood of Zechariah. If you know what I'm talking about, he'll say this generation will be held accountable essentially for the blood of righteous Abel all the way down to Zechariah. But also the letter to the Hebrews, we'll see that Jesus' blood, that's the word, his blood speaks a better word than Abel's. But the flood narrative also, when we think about the ground receiving the blood or the blood-soaked ground, the flood narrative is God addressing a planet that has been stained with innocent blood. Or God judging Pharaoh for the innocent blood shed in the Nile with the children. Or King Herod killing the baby boys under 2 when Jesus is born. We'll even see the martyrs crying out from under the altar in Revelation, and God will answer the cry of the innocent for justice. So this is just the first example of that, as we see it happen a lot throughout the rest of the scriptures. Verse 11 says, and now you, my guy, you're cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. So we'll see the ground continue to be cursed. In stories like the Exodus with Egypt, God brings plagues, not just upon the land and the people, but upon the ground specifically. again, the flood narrative, that judgment comes upon the land, the ground, and the people that inhabit that land. Judah and Israel will go into exile, and then the land will be at rest because it was filled with sin and it was, experiencing curses. And then when Israel is in disobedience at times, famine will come in the land as judgment. So God will curse the ground at times by withholding water so that there's nothing being produced. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You'll be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. The idea of being a fugitive seems reminiscent of the cities of refuge that God will install for those on the run, for his people Israel, people who accidentally take the lives of others. It's not intentional, it's not on purpose. Cain, of course, here is not innocent. Cain will flee to a city, but he's fleeing to a city as a guilty man, and he builds the city. But God will actually provide a city for the innocent manslayers later on. So it's just something to consider as we see these two ideas contrasted. Cain says to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. You've driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I'll be hidden. I'll be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me." So Cain sees himself as being hidden from the face of God as a fugitive and wanderer. And being hidden from God's face will be a term that's used throughout the Bible when God is displeased with people, or when God will actually shine his face of favor upon people, such as when God reveals his glory to Moses on Mount Sinai, and Moses' face radiates the glory and the favor of God in a visible kind of way. So we'll see that idea quite a bit. And then the Lord said, no. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. Like, you're good, my guy. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him, which isn't completely preventing the possibility of death, just decreasing the likelihood of it. God will eventually tell his people that vengeance is his, that vengeance belongs to God. So when we think about vengeance being sevenfold on Cain, Cain isn't the one deciding that. It's God. We don't even know how vengeance would be taken if someone took Cain's life, but it seems like God would oversee that. Also, when God marks Cain here for protection, it reminds me of how, now hold your thoughts, it reminds me of how God will mark his people, Israel, Abraham specifically, with circumcision, the covenant of circumcision. Or in the new covenant, when God marks his people with his spirit, spiritual baptism. Now, Cain's mark here isn't to mark Cain as righteous or accepted or, saved in that sense. But he does get a mark of a degree of protection, which seems to, just God will mark things, people, how he wants sacred space. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and you're like, where the heck did she come from? And she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, Cain called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So this city right here is very important. Cities will not just be a part of the greater biblical story. Cities will actually be symbolic of deeper spiritual realities and truths at times, such as the city of Jerusalem. The city that, like Jesus will go into Jerusalem and say, the city that stones the prophet and kills those who are sent to it. Or the heavenly city in Revelation, the people of God, descending in glory in washed robes and righteousness. So cities and actual places in the world that congregate as cities, those will often be used to communicate deeper spiritual truths about circumstances or a people. Depending on how the city is used, a city can be positive and be a place of righteousness and taking care of the orphan and widow and stranger, or a city can be used for violence and oppression and abuse. So to Enoch was born Irad. We got all these names. Lamech took 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other, you guys know, if you've been watching these, you got Godzilla here in verse 19. So there will be other men in the Bible that end up being, I'll say it like this, intimate with more than one woman, because Lamech here takes 2 wives. This is the first example, but not the only one in Scripture. We'll have people in the Bible, like Abraham, he'll take Hagar, he has Sarah, Jacob, not to condone this or say God approves of it, but there are examples in Scripture of people who just seem to miss the mark. Jacob will have Leah and Rachel, and even their two maidservants, Lot, his two daughters. The list goes on probably, but again, this is not approved by God. I just want to be thinking of how the stories might come together, where they might overlap when you see the presence of more than one wife, and usually David will take multiple wives. It's not ideal, apparently, because it causes a lot of issues in the lives of those involved. Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. I've read this a million times by now. Godzilla also bore Tubal-Cain. I know some of you probably hate that I say this. I like having fun. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. Okay, get over it. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech, boom, just goes right into Lamech just giving a speech to his wives. Like, where are they? Is he like in a treehouse, just declaring something from the top of this magnificent treehouse to his wives? I don't know why that's what comes to mind. Ada and Godzilla, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I've killed a man for wounding me and a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, Lamech's is 77-fold. Lamech takes it upon himself to decide what kind of vengeance is appropriate and when he can take life. We've already talked about this. But before I get to the vengeance thing, back to the musical instruments thing. Right before this, it talks about how the lyre and the pipe came through this line. Musical instruments will be a large part of how people relate to God later on. So even though we see seemingly musical instruments come from and are invented by the line of Cain, God will redeem these things. Musical instruments will be a part of praise. God will use the trumpets, the shofar, to blow and signify certain events as God leads Israel throughout the wilderness, or certain feasts. Musical instruments will stir on prophecy for Elisha. So there will be times in the Bible where musical instruments, David playing the harp and calming Saul, hey buddy, woo, hey, take it easy, don't kill me. So we'll see that be used. Cain's revenge here being 77-fold, like quite the jump. This 77 will be referenced, not verbatim, but think with me. When Peter comes to Jesus and he goes, how many times should I forgive my brother? 7 times? And Jesus goes, 70 times 7. Ugh. Almost as if Jesus is going even farther than Lamech's vengeance and wickedness went. Lamech here is going, Cain had 7-fold vengeance. I'm going to multiply that by 10. And I don't want to do the math right now in front of you and make a fool of myself, but Jesus is essentially exponentially multiplying that and saying the forgiveness you extend people should go beyond the degree of vengeance that wicked people want. I just see a reference to this within his statement, and I never actually saw that before reading this in light of the rest, like just this week, reading this in light of the New Testament. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Then she dramatically stares off into the distance. God restoring to people here. God restores a son to Eve. God restores to people what has been lost in stories like Job or David, or with Israel in exile, or when the people come back to Jerusalem and they rebuild the temple and the walls with Nehemiah. God is a God who restores and does new things. And that will be a theme, where God will bring life where there was death, obviously, resurrection, all that kind of stuff. And then verse 26, to Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Many people, specifically in the Old Testament, will call upon the Lord. This is a fairly new idea being introduced in the story, but think about Abraham and his wanderings. Isaac, Jacob, Noah, Daniel, Solomon. The list goes on and on. David. These great people who really follow God will be known as those who call upon the name of the Lord in their time of distress and trouble, heartache, even success and victory and achievements. So I'm doing my best to cross-reference things for you in a way that your typical study Bible might not, and to think a little deeper. Not to say that those things aren't good, but I don't know, I guess I think differently than the average Bible reader, so I want to invite you into that and to not think how I think, but to maybe think about things from a different vantage point and with a different angle in mind. Hey, I would really, really love to know what stood out to you in this session or the sessions that have come before this. What are you learning? What stood out to you? What questions do you have? What insights did you take away from this study? I'd love to let me know in the comments. It just encourages community and fellowship and conversation. So also just share what I maybe didn't see or didn't comment on or didn't even know to recognize, and then we can grow together, and hopefully this will stir on godly fellowship and conversation in the comments. The next and final session in this chapter is going to be about allusions to Jesus, and I promise you, you will not want to miss that. So I'll see you guys in the next session here in Genesis chapter 4. You know, Jesus is all over Genesis chapter 4. Right here specifically, Cain in some sense is foreshadowing Jesus. And think about what God says about Abel's blood in the ground, which is an obvious allusion to Jesus as well. And finally, we'll see that this specific city, east of Eden, is actually going to give us a glimpse into the work of Jesus. I know it sounds crazy, but when you see it, this will blow your mind. So let's talk about it and jump into Genesis chapter 4. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, "I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord." And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And if you're thinking, offering, my Jesus radar's going off, good. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. Let's talk about this. Abel is a shepherd, a sheep keeper, a keeper of sheep that brings an acceptable sacrifice to God. Who does that sound like? Jesus, especially in the letter to the Hebrews, is portrayed as not just the great high priest that brings a greater offering and does greater mediation and establishes a better covenant, but Jesus will offer a greater pleasing sacrifice to the Father as the great shepherd of the sheep, and he will be accepted with favor as the perfect, spotless, and blameless Lamb of God. Instead of Abel here offering the firstborn of a flock and the fat portions of another animal, Jesus offers himself as what John the Baptist says is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Jesus is the offering. The Lamb of God he offers to the Father is himself. So Abel brought an offering that gave him favor. Personally, he'll be regarded in God's sight. Whereas, think about this, Jesus brings an offering that's not just sufficient for him to be accepted, but it's good enough to extend the favor of God to anyone who wants to be a part of that. That's crazy. Okay, verse 4 and 5, thinking about how Abel brings what he does, the Lord has regard for Abel, but for Cain and his offering, God had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell like a toddler. I have kids, so I can say that. Verse 4 and 5, I just want to be thinking about this. The offering of Cain versus Abel. Cain brings something that is not regarded, and Cain is not regarded as well. Abel, however, brings something that is approved and accepted, and Abel himself is accepted. And I don't believe this is because of the offering necessarily, but it's just simultaneously both play off each other. Right? The offering's accepted, the person's accepted, and vice versa. So we see the Cain and Abel both have offerings that are juxtaposed to each other. And this, I believe, presents to us the difference between what man tries to bring God on his own, which is Cain, versus what Jesus brings on behalf of humanity, which is likened to what Abel brings, which is an acceptable offering. One offering is accepted to declare us righteous in God's sight, Jesus, and then what man brings on his own can never get us the favor and acceptance and grace that God gives us through Jesus. So God goes, "Why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you don't do well, sin is crouching at the door." He's warning Cain. Its desire is contrary to you, Cain, but you got to rule over it. What we're going to see right after this is that Cain is going to give in to the sinful desire. He's going to submit himself to sin. He's going to be overtaken by his sinful appetites and jealousy and anger and hatred and murderous desire. He's going to be overtaken by that. Cain is going to fail the test that was presented to him. He's going to give in to sin. But Jesus, however, is going to perfectly resist the devil in the wilderness to his face. And Jesus will never give in to the crouching beast of sin and temptation. Okay. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel, and he killed him. So we see this jealous, murderous older brother who murders the righteous, favored younger son. Just as we'll see, the religious leaders who are jealous of Jesus, they will do the same to Jesus. They'll murder him out of hatred and anger because they see God's favor on Jesus, and they'll be jealous and hateful towards Jesus because of that. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where's Abel, your brother?" Not that God doesn't know. He's giving Cain a chance to fess up. He said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. So I want to be thinking about how the blood of righteous, murdered Abel, who was acceptable and favored by God, that blood is crying out from the ground. Jesus will also die. Jesus will also go into the ground, the very heart of the earth, when he talks about how Jonah gives the religious leaders a sign of Jesus. He goes, "I'll give you a sign. Look at the sign of Jonah." I think it goes deeper than that. But Jesus' righteous blood will be shed, just like Abel is murdered. But the difference is, Jesus willingly gives himself up as an offering. Now, some might want to read into the text that Abel didn't fight back, he didn't strike, he willingly allowed himself, he chose, to remain, unhateful, unaggressive, rather than striking Cain. He chose to just let himself be murdered. I don't necessarily see that, but if we're going to make a comparison between Jesus and Abel, potentially that's there. But I just want to be thinking about Christ here for a minute. Whereas Abel brought an offering and was killed for it, think about this. Abel brings an offering. God has favor. Cain goes, "I want to kill Abel now, not myself, because I'm Cain." Abel brought an offering and was killed for it. Jesus' offering to the Father will be his obedience to the point of death. Jesus' offering to the Father will be giving his life up and shedding his blood, as opposed to offering up something and then dying for that. His offering will be obedience to the point of death. Jesus' blood in the book of Hebrews will actually be compared to the blood of Abel. Abel's blood cries out for judgment, while Jesus' blood will cry out for mercy and forgiveness. Hebrews tells us that the blood of Jesus speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Verse 11, God will actually declare Cain to be cursed. "And now you're cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength." Now right here is where I think I had the most profound revelation of Jesus in this chapter, so hang tight. "You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. You've driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I'll be hidden. Bad day. I'll be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me." Okay, let's just think about what Cain has just said. Cain has said, or God specifically says, the ground is now cursed, or you're cursed from the ground, which is already cursed because of Adam. You'll be a fugitive and a wanderer. And Cain goes, "Well, now I'm driven from the ground and from your face, and I'm in danger as a fugitive and a wanderer." I just want to be thinking about this. While Cain can't handle the punishment for his own sin, right here, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." We have a guilty murderer that cannot even handle the punishment for his own sin. Whereas Jesus, however, will personally handle the punishment for all of humanity's sin, willingly. Jesus will bring the pure and blameless sacrifice of Abel, accepted by the Father. Not to say Abel is Jesus, but to say Jesus brings a similar and better offering. Jesus took the punishment of Cain. I want you to be thinking about this. This is where the story really took a turn for me in a good way, and I really saw this in light of Christ. Jesus takes the punishment of Cain by offering up the sacrifice of Abel. I want you to think about that. The offering regarded by God was Jesus' life and obedience to the point of death. Okay? And by doing so, and by bringing the sacrifice similar to Abel, Jesus actually takes the punishment, that Cain was due. Not to say that Cain was saved or righteous. I'm saying the general punishment for sin, seen in Cain right here as an example, that general curse and condemnation and penalty Jesus takes. The punishment that Jesus bears, in contrast to Cain, the punishment Jesus bears is greater, and the sacrifice he makes is better than Abel's. Not to say that Cain exemplifies the character of Jesus, but Jesus will be treated as the criminal that Cain was. Jesus will trade places with Barabbas, right? And so what we have here is that just as Cain is cursed from the ground, Jesus will take on our curse and go into the ground, which is the heart of the earth. So we see Jesus almost stepping into both sides of the story. He brings the offering. He's righteous. He's favored. He takes the place as the righteous martyr who yields up his life on behalf of others. And by doing so, he actually stands in the place of Cain and all other wicked humanity that deserves to be penalized and condemned. And he takes every ounce of our debt upon himself, and sin is condemned in the flesh of Jesus. That's staggering. That is absolutely incredible. I don't know if I've ever thought of it like that. Back to verse 12 real quick. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength, to be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Jesus lived as an itinerant preacher. He tells someone, I have nowhere to rest. The Son of Man has nowhere to rest his head. And so Jesus lived, in some sense, as that wandering stranger. Where he came to his own, John's gospel tells us, and his own knew him not. He was treated as a stranger. He was regarded as a stranger. He wasn't known by the very world he created and brought into existence. And so wandering as a stranger like Cain, but purposely taking on that life, that's what Jesus does to undergo the worst of the human condition. Jesus does this to live as one of us, to die in our place, to experience the human condition in its entirety, which is to step into the slot of guilty criminal in our place, the way that Cain is here, the guilty criminal. Not to say Jesus is actually guilty, but he takes the place of the guilty criminal, that being all humanity in the sight of God. And so I just want us to be thinking about this. Jesus doesn't just go to the cross and he dies and he pays the debt and he resurrects. His life is it's as if he lives, not just dies as a criminal, but lives as the stranger that humanity is to God. Not to say he has no relationship with the Father, but this wandering, itinerant preacher with nowhere to rest his head just a stranger among his own. That's the idea. What we'll also see is that the estrangement Cain experiences from the presence of God is what Jesus will take on the cross. So when Cain says, behold, you've driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I'll be hidden. I'll be a fugitive and a wanderer. Whoever finds me will kill me. Jesus subjects himself to that reality. Cain is hidden and removed from the presence and the favor of God, and rightfully so. But Jesus will experience separation from the Father as the punishment for our sins, not for his own. In other words, Jesus reverses the curse by being condemned as if he did the sin. He reverses the curse of both Adam and Cain and to the fullest extent reverses it entirely to bring us back to the Eden ideal where we're in relationship with God. But first, he takes on, I just see so much of Jesus all over the story. Then the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. Now the sevenfold vengeance for Cain is something that Jesus chose not to take upon himself. So this mark, this degree of protection God extends to Cain. Jesus could have summoned legions of angels. Jesus could have fought fire with fire. And in some sense, the Father actually justly defends his Son and takes up vengeance for his Son's life being taken through the Roman armies coming in to destroy Jerusalem in AD 70 and everything that precedes that. But Jesus chooses love and sacrifice and self-givingness over violence. Not to bring sevenfold judgment, but to bring sevenfold complete forgiveness and mercy to his enemies. Whereas Cain goes, what about me? Someone's going to kill me. Jesus is not self-preserving. He trusts the Father to handle his life and where he ends up and how he comes up from the dead. And he trusts that vengeance is God's and all that stuff. Then Cain, the Lord put a mark on Cain lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, which is to say they had a child. And she conceived and bore Enoch. And when Cain built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Where do I start with this one? Cain builds his own city, but it's in separation from God. It's kind of like what we'll see the Tower of Babel later on in Shinar be like, right? But Jesus himself, according to Hebrews, is actually building his own city. Jesus himself is building his own dwelling place for God, that being the body of Christ. And he's doing that as the greater Solomon. So the city here, Nod, that is the result of murder and rebellion and exile. Okay, I'm not high-fiving Cain for building this city. This is the pinnacle and the symbol of human rebellion and wickedness in opposition to God and outside of Eden. But the city that Jesus built, the heavenly Jerusalem, the people of God, the spiritual temple, the kingdom of God, that city will be the product of sacrifice and love and perfect obedience. And so the rebellious city of human sin and wickedness will be exactly the city, Jerusalem, that Jesus chooses to walk straight into when he walks right into Jerusalem to be crucified at the hands of sinners. Jerusalem in Jesus' day is a sort of nod towards Nod. See what I did there? Let's skip down to verse 25. Skip over the descendants of Cain. I'm sure there's some stuff we can find in there, but verse 25, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Cain killed him. The offspring that God gives to Eve seems to be a callback to the promised seed of the woman in Genesis chapter 3, where God promised that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, and that is Jesus. But Jesus doesn't crush the heads of people like Cain does. Jesus crushes the head of the enemy, death and spiritual darkness and evil. He crushes the heads of those enemies by dying like Abel. And through that death, God appoints for himself more offspring, more children, besides his son Jesus. Jesus brings about our sonship so that we can be called sons and daughters of God. Jesus brings that about through his own death and resurrection. So when the enemy tries to stop the seed of the woman here by killing Abel through the hands of Cain, God gives her another offspring. And I think that right there, God bringing life in response to death, that's a picture of Jesus being put to death only to bring us life and sonship through his death. So where the enemy thought he won and conquered, Jesus, he played right into the hands of God and brought more life and more children unto God. Not Satan doing that, but he played a part in, crucifying Jesus, handing him over, and then God goes, bingo, bango, right where I want you. Through that, God brings about our salvation and righteousness through his son. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. And so through Seth's line, people call upon the Lord. And through Jesus, we come to God in worship and call upon God's name boldly as those who come through the line and heritage of Jesus, the true and ultimate heir of the universe, the true seed of the woman who crushes the head of the serpent. So this will conclude our study on Genesis chapter 4. I would love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear, let me know in the comments if you've followed this whole series or if you're just watching this one. Let me know what thoughts you have, what questions you have, what revelations you have, what insights you now have, what stood out to you, what did you learn, what did you take away? I'd love to hear that. Please let me know in the comments below, and that'll be a blessing to me because it just reinforces what we're learning together as a community. All right. And then next week we will continue our study in Genesis somewhere. All right. I'll see you guys in that session. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to share your thoughts and your insights in the comments. And thank you for supporting this ministry. Your support helps us accomplish our mission, which is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. We're only able to make all of these free resources because of generous supporters like you. So thank you very much for all of your support. Make sure to visit abovereproachministry.com to check out all of our free resources. And as always, keep moving towards Jesus.